Tony Carver's life was a portrait of suburban bliss. Every morning, the alarm clock would chime at precisely 6:30 a.m., pulling him from a deep sleep into the familiar embrace of another day. His wife, Emily, was always the first to rise, her silhouette framed by the soft morning light that streamed through the curtains. Tony would watch her for a few moments, her gentle movements as she got ready for the day a soothing routine he'd come to cherish. Their home, a modest but cozy two-story house in the heart of a quiet neighborhood, was the epitome of stability. The white picket fence that surrounded their property was more than just a barrier, it was a symbol of the life they'd built together. Inside, every room told a story. The living room, with its worn but comfortable furniture, was where they spent countless evenings curled up together, sharing the warmth of each other's company. The kitchen, Emily's domain, was where she worked her magic, filling the house with the mouth-watering aromas of home-cooked meals. Tony's life revolved around routines, and he found comfort in their predictability. He worked a steady job at an insurance company, where he was well-liked by his colleagues and respected by his superiors. Every day, he would walk the same path to the train station, board the 7:45 a.m. train, and settle into his usual seat. He knew the names of the regular passengers, even if he never spoke to them. It was a quiet life, but it was his, and he was content. Emily was the light of Tony's life. She had a warmth about her that drew people in, a kindness that was evident in everything she did. She was the type of person who remembered birthdays, who baked cookies for the neighbors, and who volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. To Tony, she was perfection personified. Her laugh was like music, and her smile could brighten even the darkest of days. Their evenings were simple but filled with love. After dinner, they would often take a walk around the neighborhood, holding hands like teenagers in love. They talked about their day, shared their thoughts, and made plans for the future. They dreamed of traveling the world together, of starting a family, of growing old side by side. To Tony, these were more than just dreams, they were promises, as real as the ground beneath his feet. On Sundays, they had a tradition. They would visit the local farmer's market, where Emily would pick out the freshest ingredients for their meals, and Tony would carry the bags, playfully complaining about how much she bought. It was a small ritual, but one that Tony looked forward to every week. It was moments like these that made life worth living. To anyone looking in from the outside, Tony and Emily's life was picture perfect. They were the couple everyone admired, the ones who seemed to have it all. But to Tony, it was more than just appearances. It was the truth of his existence. He had everything he ever wanted: a loving wife, a stable job, a peaceful home. Life was good, and Tony never took it for granted. As he lay in bed each night, with Emily's head resting on his chest, Tony would think about how lucky he was. He would silently thank whatever force had brought Emily into his life and pray that nothing would ever change. In those quiet moments, with the world outside their window drifting into sleep, Tony felt a deep, abiding sense of contentment. But life, as Tony would soon discover, has a way of shattering even the most perfect of illusions. The routines that once brought him comfort would soon become chains that bound him to a past he could never reclaim. And the life he had taken such comfort in would soon be nothing more than a distant memory. But for now, Tony slept, unaware of the storm that was gathering on the horizon, blissfully content in the perfect life he had built with the woman he loved. The morning of the tragedy began like any other. Tony woke up to the gentle sound of Emily's breathing, her head resting on his chest. The sun had just begun to peek through the curtains, casting a soft glow across their bedroom. Tony stretched, smiled, and pressed a tender kiss to Emily's forehead before sliding out of bed. He tiptoed to the kitchen, his routine now as ingrained as his heartbeat. The smell of coffee brewing was a comforting ritual, and as Tony prepared breakfast, he felt a familiar sense of peace. Emily shuffled into the kitchen, her hair tousled but her smile as radiant as ever. They exchanged a few playful words and shared a quiet breakfast, savoring the simplicity of their morning routine. It was an ordinary day, and there was no indication of the horror that was about to unfold. By mid-morning, Tony was at work, immersed in his tasks, when his phone rang. The name flashing on the screen made his heart skip a beat, Emily's doctor. The urgency in the voice on the other end of the line sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Carver, we need you to come to the hospital immediately. There's been an incident." Tony's hands trembled as he hung up the phone, the words, "an incident," echoing in his mind like a harbinger of doom. Panic surged through him as he rushed out of the office, barely acknowledging the concerned glances of his colleagues. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. The city's familiar streets seemed foreign and menacing as Tony weaved through traffic, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. When he finally arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the harsh fluorescent lights seemed to amplify his sense of dread. He was directed to the waiting area, where he was met by a doctor with a somber expression. "Mr. Carver," the doctor said gently, "I'm afraid there's been a serious complication." Tony's heart sank. What happened? Where is she? She was brought in for a routine procedure, the doctor continued. There were unforeseen complications. We did everything we could, but, the words felt like a blow to the gut. Tony struggled to process the reality that was crashing down around him. Is Emily? "I'm so sorry," the doctor said softly, "but she didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt, and Tony's knees buckled. He was caught by a nurse who guided him to a chair. The room spun as he tried to comprehend the enormity of the loss. Emily, the love of his life, was gone. The thought was unbearable, a dark abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. Hours passed in a blur of numbness and disbelief. The hospital staff spoke to him, offering condolences and asking questions he could barely answer. Tony's mind was a fog of grief, and he could hardly remember how he got home. The house was eerily quiet when he returned. The familiar surroundings now felt cold and alien. The photos of happier times, the warmth of their home, all seemed to mock him with their normalcy. Tony wandered through the rooms, touching the places where Emily's presence had been. The kitchen, now a barren space, the bedroom that felt like a crypt, all reminders of the life that had been so cruelly taken from him. Tony sank onto the couch, the weight of the day's events crashing down on him. He clutched a framed photo of Emily and himself, taken during one of their many happy moments. Tears streamed down his face as he held the photo close, his sobs echoing through the empty house. The pain was unbearable, a deep, gnawing ache that seemed to consume every part of him. The house, once a sanctuary of love and comfort, was now a mausoleum of memories. Tony was alone in a world that had been irrevocably altered. The routines he once found solace in now felt like chains, binding him to a past that was no longer real. The future, once bright with promise, was now a void, filled with the echoes of a life that could never be reclaimed. As the day turned to night, Tony's sorrow was complete. He was left alone with his grief, the house still and silent, a testament to the love and loss that had defined his life. The tragedy had shattered his world, leaving him adrift in a sea of pain, struggling to find his way in a life that would never be the same. The days following Emily's death blurred together into a dismal haze. Tony's once familiar world had been turned upside down, and he found himself sinking deeper into a chasm of grief and isolation. The once warm house now felt like a cold, empty shell, and each room seemed to echo with the ghostly remnants of Emily's presence. Tony's daily routine had disintegrated. He stopped going to work. The thought of facing colleagues and pretending to be normal was too overwhelming. Instead, he stayed in the house, moving through the motions of the day in a trance-like state. Mornings began with him staring blankly at the untouched breakfast table, his once cherished routines now serving as painful reminders of what he had lost. He had tried to keep busy, cleaning and tidying the house, but each task only served as a reminder of Emily's absence. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the aroma of cooking, was now a silent, sterile space. The living room, where they had spent countless evenings together, felt like a mausoleum. Tony would sit there for hours, staring at the television without really watching, or flipping through photo albums that only deepened his sorrow. Tony's isolation was both physical and emotional. Friends and family reached out, offering condolences and support, but he avoided them all. The idea of engaging with anyone felt like a Herculean task. He couldn't muster the energy to respond to phone calls or answer the door. He felt detached from the world outside, as if he were living in a different reality from everyone else. Even when he did interact with others, his responses were flat and disinterested. He would nod mechanically, offer terse replies, and quickly retreat into himself. The connection he once felt with people seemed to have dissolved, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. The vibrant Tony who had once been known for his warmth and charm was now a shadow of himself, consumed by an overwhelming sadness. His nights were the worst. The darkness brought with it a crushing loneliness. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of Emily. The silence of the house was deafening, and he often found himself reaching out to the empty space beside him, as if expecting her to be there. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by nightmares that left him waking in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The house, once a symbol of comfort and love, had become a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him, the familiar rooms now suffocating. Tony avoided leaving the house, unable to face the outside world. The once familiar sights of his neighborhood now seemed alien, and the idea of interacting with strangers filled him with dread. Food lost its appeal, and Tony's appetite waned. He lived on a diet of takeout and convenience foods, eating only when hunger forced him to. Meals were consumed in silence, often while staring blankly at the wall. The joy of cooking, once a shared activity with Emily, had become another painful reminder of what he had lost. As the weeks passed, Tony's grief deepened into depression. He found himself sinking further into a state of numbness and despair. The world outside seemed to move on without him, and he felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of sadness. Each day was a struggle, and the prospect of facing the future seemed unbearable. Tony's once gregarious nature had been replaced by a deep-seated withdrawal. He avoided social interactions, choosing instead to isolate himself in the house. His once immaculate appearance deteriorated as he stopped shaving and neglected personal hygiene. The mirror reflected a man who had lost his vitality, a stark contrast to the Tony who had once radiated life and energy. In his darkest moments, Tony would sometimes sit in the attic, surrounded by boxes of old memories. He would sift through old letters, keepsakes, and photographs, each item a painful reminder of a time when life was full of promise. The attic became his refuge, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, but it was also a place where his grief seemed to magnify, as if the weight of his sorrow was concentrated in that small, dusty space. Tony's descent into depression was marked by a sense of futility. He felt like a spectator in his own life, unable to effect any change or find any semblance of joy. The world outside continued to turn, indifferent to his suffering. He was left to navigate his grief alone, searching for a way to make sense of a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. In the midst of his isolation, there was a part of Tony that yearned for connection, for someone to understand the depth of his pain. But the walls he had erected around himself were too high, and the distance he had put between himself and the world felt insurmountable. He was lost in a sea of sorrow, struggling to find his way back to a life that seemed impossibly distant. The day of Emily's funeral dawned cold and gray, mirroring the heaviness that had settled over Tony's heart. The sky was a leaden blanket, threatening rain, and the world seemed to move in slow motion as he prepared for the day ahead. He felt as though he were moving through a dream, each step and action detached from reality. The house was filled with flowers, cards, and condolences, but the gestures of sympathy did little to alleviate the profound sense of loss that Tony felt. He stood in front of a mirror, struggling to adjust his tie, but his hands trembled so much that he could barely manage the task. The once familiar routine of getting dressed now felt alien, each movement a painful reminder of Emily's absence. When Tony finally arrived at the church, he was met with a sea of somber faces. Friends, family, and acquaintances had gathered to pay their respects, but Tony felt as though he were an outsider looking in. He recognized many of the faces, people who had been a part of his and Emily's life, but their presence offered little comfort. Instead, it underscored his profound sense of isolation. The church was adorned with flowers and candles, the scent of lilies and roses mingling with the incense. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, and the mournful strains of the organ filled the air, adding to the somber mood. Tony found a seat in the front pew, the weight of the world pressing down on him as he tried to steady his breathing. As the service began, Tony struggled to focus on the words being spoken. The minister's voice was a distant murmur, the comforting promises of eternal peace and solace barely penetrating Tony's numbed consciousness. He glanced around at the faces of those who had come to mourn Emily, and for a moment, he felt a pang of guilt for not being able to fully appreciate their support. He knew they cared, but their presence only served as a reminder of how alone he felt. When it was time for the eulogies, Tony was struck by the stories that were shared. Friends and family spoke of Emily's kindness, her unwavering generosity, and her ability to light up any room she entered. Their words painted a portrait of a woman who had touched many lives, and Tony felt a sharp ache in his chest as he listened. He had always known Emily was special, but hearing others speak of her in such glowing terms made her loss even more palpable. As the service drew to a close, Tony was overcome by a sense of finality. The casket, adorned with flowers, was being wheeled toward the hearse, and the reality of the situation hit him with full force. Emily, who had once been the very essence of his life, was now gone forever. The thought was almost unbearable, a cruel twist of fate that left him feeling hollow and empty. The procession to the cemetery was a somber affair, with cars lined up behind the hearse as they made their way through the gray, rain-slicked streets. Tony sat in the back of the car, staring out the window but seeing nothing. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion, the raindrops streaking down the glass like tears he could no longer shed. At the cemetery, the cold wind whipped through the air, and the ground was damp and uneven. Tony stood at the edge of the grave, his heart heavy with a grief that seemed insurmountable. The coffin was lowered into the ground, and as the earth was slowly covered over, Tony felt a profound sense of loss. The finality of the act was like a physical blow, and he could barely keep himself upright. The attendees moved slowly, exchanging quiet words of comfort and condolences, but Tony felt detached from the proceedings. The faces of those around him were a blur, their words lost in the fog of his despair. He could barely process the reality of the day, the rituals and ceremonies all seeming like a distant, dispassionate formality. As the crowd began to disperse, Tony lingered by the grave, unable to tear himself away. He stared at the fresh mound of earth, his mind filled with memories of Emily. He thought of their shared dreams, their plans for the future, and the life that had been so cruelly taken from him. The cemetery, with its solemn gravestones and quiet, seemed like an extension of his own grief, a place where his sorrow could find a temporary home. In the days that followed, Tony found himself struggling to come to terms with the finality of Emily's death. The funeral had marked the end of a chapter, but it had also opened the door to a future he was unprepared to face. The grief was all-consuming, and the weight of the reality of his loss settled heavily upon him. The funeral was over, but the journey through grief had just begun. Tony was left to navigate the void that Emily's absence had created, and the path ahead seemed fraught with darkness and uncertainty. The reality of his loss was inescapable, and the burden of facing a future without Emily was a challenge that seemed almost too great to bear. The house was quiet once again, the echoes of the funeral service and the mournful voices of well-wishers now replaced by an oppressive silence. Tony had spent the past few days in a fog of grief, moving through the empty rooms as if in a daze. The familiar surroundings now felt foreign and unwelcoming, each corner a reminder of the life he had once known. It was on a particularly gray afternoon, as Tony was attempting to clean out a closet in a desperate bid to occupy his mind, that he made a discovery. The task was one of many he had set for himself, a futile attempt to find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of his sorrow. He had begun sorting through a box of old letters, photographs, and keepsakes that had been tucked away for years. Among the items, Tony found a small, weathered envelope, its edges frayed with age. The envelope was unmarked, but something about it drew Tony's attention. He carefully opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside. The handwriting on the page was unmistakable, Emily's delicate script, so familiar and comforting. Tony's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. The paper felt like a lifeline to the past, and he hesitated for a moment before reading the words that had been written just for him. Dear Tony, if you are reading this, then I am no longer by your side. I am writing this letter because I want you to know how deeply I love you and how much you have meant to me. I know that my departure will leave a void in your life, and I wish I could be there to comfort you and guide you through the pain. When we first met, I never imagined how deeply you would become a part of my life. Every moment we shared was a blessing, and I cherished every single one of them. I am so grateful for the life we built together, the laughter we shared, and the dreams we dared to pursue. You are my rock, my confidant, and my greatest joy. That I want you to know that it is okay to grieve, and it is okay to feel lost. The pain you are feeling is a testament to the love we shared. But please, don't let it consume you. Remember that life is precious, and there is still so much beauty to be found in the world. I believe in you, Tony. I know you have the strength to move forward, even if it feels impossible right now. That I want you to live your life fully, as we always dreamed of doing. Take the trips we talked about, pursue your passions, and find joy in the small things. I may not be with you in person, but I will always be with you in spirit. My love for you is eternal, and it will guide you even when I am not there to hold your hand. Please remember that I loved you with all my heart, and I always will. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I am so proud of the life we shared. I hope you find peace and happiness, and I hope that you can look back on our time together with fondness and joy. Until we meet again, my love, know that you are never truly alone. I am with you in every sunrise, every gentle breeze, and every moment of beauty you encounter. With all my love, Emily. Tony's eyes were blurred with tears as he read the letter. Emily's words were a balm to his wounded soul, a reminder of the love they had shared and the life they had built together. The letter was both a comfort and a challenge, a reminder of the strength Emily had seen in him, even when he struggled to see it in himself. As he finished reading, Tony sat quietly, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. The weight of Emily's words was both soothing and sobering. He felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a deep appreciation for the final gift she had left him. The letter was a bridge to the past, a connection to the love that had once filled his life. The realization that Emily had known she might be leaving him, and had prepared this letter with such care, brought both comfort and pain. It was as if she had reached out from beyond, offering him guidance and solace in the midst of his sorrow. Tony could almost feel her presence, her love wrapping around him like a warm embrace. In the days that followed, Tony found himself returning to the letter often. It became a source of strength and inspiration, a reminder of the life he had once shared with Emily and the promise of moving forward. Each time he read it, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to honor her memory by living the life they had always dreamed of. The letter became a touchstone for Tony, a symbol of the enduring love that had shaped his life. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was hope and light to be found. Emily's final words were a guiding force, helping him navigate the difficult path of grief and find a way to move forward, carrying her memory with him as he began to rebuild his life. The weeks following Emily's funeral were a blur of gray and sorrow, but the letter she had left behind was a beacon of light cutting through the darkness. Tony read it repeatedly, each time finding new layers of meaning in Emily's words. The letter had a profound impact on his perspective, slowly beginning to shift the way he viewed his life and his future. The morning after he first read the letter, Tony woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun was shining through the window, casting warm beams across the room. It was a simple yet poignant reminder that life continued, even in the midst of grief. He had spent so many days shut off from the world, but Emily's words had sparked something within him, a desire to engage with life once again. Tony started to make small changes in his daily routine. He began with simple acts, making his bed in the morning, preparing a proper breakfast, and taking walks around the neighborhood. These small steps, though seemingly insignificant, were a declaration of his intention to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Each action was a testament to his commitment to honor Emily's memory by living a life she would have been proud of. One day, while walking through the park, Tony came across a group of children playing soccer. Their laughter and energy were infectious, and he found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. The joy in their carefree play was a reminder of the simple pleasures in life. He realized that he had been so consumed by his grief that he had forgotten how to find happiness in the small things. Emily's letter had given him a new perspective, a reminder that life was precious and worth living. Tony's newfound outlook prompted him to reach out to his friends and family. He had previously avoided their calls and messages, overwhelmed by his own pain, but he now recognized the importance of connection. Reconnecting with loved ones was a difficult but necessary step toward healing. He started by inviting a few close friends over for coffee, something he had once enjoyed but had neglected in his grief. The conversations were initially awkward, but as he began to open up about his feelings and the letter, the connections grew stronger. His friends were supportive and understanding, offering their own words of encouragement and comfort. Inspired by Emily's encouragement to pursue his passions, Tony began to revisit interests he had set aside. He had always loved painting, a hobby he had abandoned years ago. One afternoon, he retrieved his old easel and brushes from the attic, setting them up in the living room. As he began to paint, he felt a sense of liberation. The act of creating was both therapeutic and cathartic. It allowed him to channel his emotions into something beautiful and meaningful, a fitting tribute to Emily's memory. Tony also started to explore new experiences. He signed up for a cooking class, something he and Emily had talked about doing together. It was a way for him to embrace new challenges and create new memories. The classes were a source of joy and a reminder of how much life had to offer, even in the midst of loss. Each dish he prepared was a step toward reclaiming his sense of self and finding fulfillment in new endeavors. As time went on, Tony began to see the world through a different lens. He noticed the beauty in everyday moments, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the warmth of a smile from a stranger. Emily's letter had opened his eyes to the importance of appreciating life's simple pleasures and finding joy even in the midst of pain. Tony's transformation was gradual but profound. He started to engage more fully with the world around him, seeking out experiences and connections that enriched his life. His grief did not disappear, but it became a part of his journey rather than the defining feature of his existence. The letter had given him a new perspective, a way to navigate his sorrow while still finding meaning and purpose in life. One evening, as Tony sat in his studio, painting with renewed vigor, he reflected on how far he had come. Emily's letter had been a catalyst for change, a source of strength that had guided him through his darkest days. Her words had been a reminder of the love they had shared and the life they had dreamed of living together. By embracing that love and honoring her memory, Tony had found a way to move forward and build a future that celebrated both his past and his present. In the end, Emily's letter had done more than offer comfort, it had provided Tony with a new way of seeing the world. It had shifted his perspective from one of despair to one of hope, from isolation to connection. Tony had learned to embrace life once again, to find beauty and meaning in the midst of grief, and to carry Emily's memory forward in a way that would make her proud. Tony's new outlook on life was not without its challenges. While the letter from Emily had sparked a profound shift in his perspective, embracing a new way of living was not an instantaneous process. It required Tony to confront the aspects of his old self that had been defined by caution and conformity. The first true test of his transformed attitude came in a way he had not anticipated. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and Tony was out running errands. He had been sticking to his new routine, engaging more with the world around him, and trying to push past his old habits. As he drove through the city streets, he noticed a lively scene unfolding at a street corner. A small, makeshift market had sprung up, selling everything from handmade crafts to exotic foods. It was a spontaneous event, brimming with vibrant energy that Tony found irresistibly enticing. Feeling a surge of curiosity, Tony decided to stop and explore. He parked his car and wandered into the throng of people. The market was bustling with activity, and the air was filled with the aroma of spices and the sound of cheerful banter. Tony felt a pang of excitement as he navigated through the stalls, his senses awakening to the vibrancy of the scene. At one stall, he came across a vendor selling gourmet hot sauces, each bottle more colorful and exotic than the last. Tony was immediately intrigued. In the past, he had always been cautious about trying new and potentially risky things, preferring the safety of the familiar. But today felt different. Today, he was ready to embrace a more adventurous spirit. Without overthinking, Tony approached the vendor and engaged in a lively conversation about the sauces. The vendor, a charismatic young woman with a passion for her craft, enthusiastically explained the different flavors and heat levels. Tony, feeling a sudden burst of spontaneity, decided to purchase several bottles of the most exotic sauces available. As he carried the bags back to his car, a sense of exhilaration washed over him. It was a small act, but it felt significant, a departure from his old self and an embrace of a more adventurous, devil-may-care attitude. It was a symbol of his willingness to step out of his comfort zone and embrace new experiences. Later that evening, Tony hosted a small dinner for a few close friends. He had decided to cook a meal using the hot sauces he had purchased, wanting to share his newfound sense of adventure with those around him. The dinner was casual but filled with laughter and camaraderie. Tony's friends were intrigued by the exotic sauces and were impressed by his willingness to try something new. Throughout the evening, Tony noticed a shift in himself. He was more relaxed, more open, and more willing to embrace the unexpected. He found joy in the simple act of sharing his new experiences with others, and it felt liberating to let go of his old inhibitions. The following week, Tony's devil-may-care attitude continued to manifest in various ways. He began taking risks he had previously shunned, both big and small. He signed up for a spontaneous road trip with friends, something he had always been hesitant to do. He attended a live music festival, immersing himself in the chaotic but exhilarating atmosphere. He even enrolled in a dance class, something he had never considered before but now felt excited to try. Each new experience was a step away from his old self, a break from the predictable and the safe. Tony's willingness to embrace the unexpected became a defining characteristic of his new attitude. He found that these small acts of defiance against his old habits were empowering. They allowed him to rediscover aspects of himself that had been dormant for years, and they brought a renewed sense of excitement and purpose to his life. As Tony continued to embrace his devil-may-care attitude, he realized that it was not about recklessness but about living life to its fullest. It was about finding joy in the unpredictable, celebrating the present moment, and pushing past the fears that had once held him back. The new approach to life was both exhilarating and challenging, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Tony's transformation was a testament to the power of change and the impact of embracing a new perspective. The letter from Emily had been the catalyst, but it was his willingness to act on that newfound outlook that had truly reshaped his life. By stepping out of his comfort zone and embracing the unknown, Tony had begun to live a life that honored Emily's memory while also celebrating his own potential for growth and discovery. As he looked back on his journey, Tony felt a sense of gratitude for the challenges he had faced and the changes he had embraced. The devil-may-care attitude was not just a new way of living, it was a celebration of life itself, a reminder that even in the midst of grief and loss, there was still so much to be discovered and enjoyed. The vibrant new outlook Tony had embraced was exhilarating, but it came with its own set of complications. As he shed the constraints of his former self, he found that not everyone in his old life could keep pace with his transformation. The friends and acquaintances who had once been a part of his routine were no longer in sync with the person he was becoming. The dissonance between his old life and his new attitude began to create tension, leading Tony to make a decisive, though difficult, choice. He would sever ties with the past in order to fully embrace his new self. It started with subtle changes, skipping out on regular social gatherings and avoiding familiar places that once held sentimental value. The first sign of trouble came when Tony canceled a long-standing dinner invitation with his old friends. The excuse was a vague, work commitment, but it was clear that he was no longer interested in the predictable routines of his past. The following weekend, Tony had planned a gathering at his apartment to showcase his latest culinary experiment with the hot sauces he had bought. His old friends, who had been supportive during his period of grief, were invited, but Tony's excitement for the event felt overshadowed by an underlying discomfort. They had been friends for years, but as Tony delved deeper into his new mindset, he found himself growing increasingly impatient with their more conventional outlooks and conversations. As his guests arrived, Tony attempted to mask his inner turmoil with a friendly demeanor. The conversation flowed as it always had, but Tony noticed a growing distance between himself and the people he had once felt so close to. Their conversations revolved around familiar topics: work, family updates, and the mendacities of life. Tony found himself detached, his mind drifting to the new experiences and adventures he was craving. The final catalyst for his decision came during a conversation with his friend Mark. They had been discussing their usual weekend routines when Mark made a comment about how Tony's recent changes were a bit out of character. The words stung more than Tony had anticipated, revealing a chasm between his old self and his new persona. It became clear to him that, despite his efforts to fit in, he was fundamentally different now, and so were his relationships. In the weeks that followed, Tony took decisive steps to distance himself from his old life. He stopped attending the gatherings he had once been a regular part of, and he politely declined invitations with reasons that were increasingly vague. He cleared out old contacts from his phone, deleting numbers of people he no longer felt aligned with his current path. The process was both liberating and painful, as it meant confronting the reality of change and the consequences it brought. One day, Tony decided to visit his old workplace, a place that had once been a significant part of his life. He had left his job shortly after Emily's death, and his return was intended to clear out his personal belongings and say his goodbyes. The office, filled with the hum of activity and familiar faces, felt strangely foreign. He greeted a few colleagues with forced cheerfulness, exchanging polite small talk that only underscored the growing distance between them. As Tony packed up his things, he reflected on the relationships and experiences that had once defined him. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with a sense of nostalgia and finality. He realized that burning these bridges was not about rejection but about creating space for personal growth and new beginnings. The final act of severing ties came with a heartfelt letter to his closest friends. In it, Tony expressed his gratitude for their support during his grieving period and explained that he was undergoing significant changes in his life. He acknowledged that his new outlook and interests were leading him in a different direction, and he needed to step away to fully embrace his new path. The letter was honest but respectful, and it allowed Tony to exit his old life with a sense of closure and dignity. The response from his friends was mixed. Some were understanding and supportive, while others were hurt or confused. Tony respected their reactions, recognizing that his decision to burn the bridges was a necessary part of his personal evolution. He needed to forge a new path, and that required leaving behind the familiar and the comfortable. In the days that followed, Tony felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The decision to cut ties with his old friends and life was not easy, but it was essential for his growth. He embraced the solitude that came with his new direction, using it as an opportunity to further explore his interests and develop new connections that aligned with his evolving self. Tony's journey was far from over, but he was more confident than ever in his new path. Burning the bridges to his old life had been a painful but crucial step in his transformation. It allowed him to fully commit to his new attitude and embrace the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. With each step forward, Tony was building a future that was uniquely his own, one that honored his past while celebrating the potential of his new beginnings. Tony had become well acquainted with the thrill of living life on the edge. His new devil-may-care attitude had pushed him to embrace challenges and seek out experiences that had once been foreign to him. Yet, despite the exhilarating freedom he had found, there remained one challenge that he hadn't fully confronted: the world of high-stakes risk. The opportunity presented itself in an unexpected way. Tony had been exploring new social circles, meeting people who shared his newfound zest for life. One evening, at an underground jazz club he frequented, he struck up a conversation with a charismatic man named Leo. Leo was an entrepreneur with a taste for risk, known for his high-stakes poker games and lucrative but precarious ventures. Tony was intrigued by Leo's stories of gambling and business deals. He found himself drawn to the idea of testing his limits in a way that went beyond his current adventures. It was not just the thrill of the gamble that appealed to him, but the opportunity to confront his fears head-on and prove to himself that he could handle high-stakes situations. Leo invited Tony to a private poker game that he was hosting, a gathering notorious for its fierce competition and substantial stakes. Tony, fueled by his newfound daring spirit, accepted the invitation. The event was set for a week later at a discreet location, an exclusive club with a reputation for high-stakes games and elite clientele. As the day of the game approached, Tony's excitement mingled with a sense of trepidation. He had never played in a high-stakes game before, and the potential for loss was significant. The stakes were not just financial but also emotional. For Tony, this gamble represented a test of his newfound attitude, a way to prove that he could handle the intensity of risk and the potential consequences that came with it. When Tony arrived at the club, he was struck by the opulence of the venue. The room was dimly lit, with plush furnishings and a private, almost secretive ambience. The poker table was set in the center, surrounded by a group of men and women who exuded confidence and authority. Leo greeted Tony with a nod, his demeanor both welcoming and intimidating. Tony took his seat at the table, trying to mask his nervousness with a veneer of confidence. As the game began, he quickly realized that this was no ordinary poker match. The players were skilled, their strategies sophisticated, and the stakes were sky-high. The chips in play represented more than just money, they symbolized status, power, and the thrill of the game. For the first few rounds, Tony held his own. He relied on the skills he had honed in less intense settings and tried to stay focused on the game. However, as the night wore on, the pressure mounted. The bets grew larger, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Tony's heart raced with each hand, the excitement and anxiety intertwining in a potent in a pivotal hand. Tony found himself in a precarious position. He had a strong hand but was facing a significant bet from one of the more aggressive players. The decision before him was to either fold and walk away with a loss or go all in and risk everything he had staked. The moment felt surreal, a culmination of his journey from a cautious man to someone willing to take a bold gamble. Tony's mind raced as he weighed his options. The thought of losing everything was daunting, but so was the prospect of walking away without fully testing his limits. He glanced around the table, taking in the intense focus of the other players. In that moment, he made a choice that embodied his new devil-may-care attitude. He went all in. The room fell silent as the remaining players revealed their hands. The tension was palpable as the cards were laid out. Tony's hand was strong, but he knew that luck played a significant role in the game. As the final card was revealed, Tony's heart skipped a beat. He had won the hand, a triumphant moment that confirmed his gamble had paid off. The victory was exhilarating, but it was also a sobering reminder of the thin line between success and failure. The thrill of the win was tempered by the realization of how easily things could have gone the other way. Tony's heart was still racing as he collected his winnings, the adrenaline of the gamble still coursing through his veins. As he left the club, Tony reflected on the experience. The high-stakes poker game had been a test of his new attitude, a challenge that had pushed him to confront his fears and embrace risk. The victory was a validation of his decision to embrace a more daring approach to life, but it also highlighted the unpredictable nature of his journey, the gamble had been a significant step, but it was not the end of Tony's transformation. It was a reminder that living a life of risk and adventure came with its own set of challenges and rewards. Tony was now more confident in his ability to handle high-stakes situations, but he also understood the importance of balancing daring with caution. As he walked through the city streets, the cool night air felt invigorating. Tony had taken a significant risk and emerged victorious, but he knew that the journey was far from over. His new attitude had opened doors to a world of possibilities, and he was ready to continue exploring, embracing both the excitement and the challenges that lay ahead. Tony's victory at the poker table was more than just a financial gain, it was a profound affirmation of his new way of living. The rush of exhilaration from taking a bold gamble had ignited a fire within him, fueling an intense desire for freedom and adventure. The experience had shown him the thrill of living on the edge, and Tony was eager to chase that feeling as far as it would take him. The following weeks were marked by a series of impulsive and exhilarating decisions. Tony's newfound recklessness manifested in various aspects of his life, from spontaneous adventures to daring choices that defied his old, cautious persona. The sense of liberation he felt was intoxicating, and he reveled in the freedom that came with breaking away from his predictable past. One sunny Saturday morning, Tony decided to indulge in a completely unplanned road trip. He had recently met a group of adventurous souls through a new social circle, and they had mentioned a remote, picturesque town several hours away that was known for its stunning natural beauty. The thought of exploring a new destination on a whim was irresistible to Tony. Without much deliberation, Tony packed a few essentials, including a camera to capture the journey, and set off in his car. The road stretched out before him, and with each mile, he felt a sense of liberation that came from leaving behind the familiar. The spontaneity of the trip was a testament to his newfound approach to life, and he embraced every moment with a sense of eager anticipation. As Tony drove through scenic landscapes and winding roads, he was captivated by the beauty that unfolded around him. The trip was filled with unexpected discoveries, a hidden waterfall, a charming cafe nestled in a forest, and friendly locals who welcomed him with open arms. Each new experience added to the thrill of his journey, and Tony found himself fully immersed in the freedom of the moment. During one of his stops, Tony encountered a group of fellow travelers who were planning a hiking expedition to a remote viewpoint. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Tony, driven by his devil-may-care attitude, decided to join them. The hike was challenging, with rugged terrain and steep inclines, but the reward at the summit was breathtaking, a panoramic view of the landscape stretching out as far as the eye could see. Standing at the top, Tony felt a profound sense of accomplishment and exhilaration. The freedom of the open air, the thrill of the climb, and the beauty of the view were a perfect reflection of his new mindset. He realized that his journey of self-discovery was not just about breaking away from his old life, but about embracing the boundless possibilities that came with it. Back in the city, Tony's newfound recklessness continued to influence his daily life. He began taking more risks in his professional endeavors, exploring creative projects that had once seemed too daring. He invested in startups with bold visions, attended unconventional events, and pursued hobbies that challenged his comfort zone. Each risk he took was a testament to his commitment to living a life without regrets. The impact of Tony's new attitude extended beyond his personal experiences. He found himself connecting with people who shared his enthusiasm for living on the edge. His social circle became a vibrant mix of adventurers, creatives, and risk-takers, each contributing to a dynamic and stimulating environment. The relationships he formed were built on shared experiences and a mutual appreciation for pushing boundaries. Despite the thrill of his newfound freedom, Tony was not immune to the occasional pangs of self-doubt. There were moments when he questioned whether his recklessness was masking deeper issues or if he was simply seeking distraction from his grief. These moments of introspection were brief but significant, as they reminded him of the delicate balance between embracing adventure and maintaining self-awareness. One evening, while reflecting on his journey, Tony visited a quiet park, a place that had once been a refuge during his times of grief. Sitting on a bench, he watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The tranquility of the park provided a stark contrast to the whirlwind of his recent adventures, offering a moment of calm reflection. Tony realized that his pursuit of freedom and exhilaration was not just about escaping his past but about finding a new way to live meaningfully. The risks he had taken and the adventures he had embraced were part of a broader quest for self-discovery and fulfillment. The taste of freedom he had experienced was both exhilarating and enlightening, and it had taught him the value of balancing daring with introspection. As he left the park, Tony felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. His journey of embracing recklessness had been a transformative experience, but it was also a reminder of the importance of self-awareness and reflection. The taste of freedom he had savored was a powerful motivator, propelling him forward as he continued to explore the limitless possibilities of his new life. With each new adventure, Tony was not only redefining his own sense of freedom but also discovering new dimensions of himself. The exhilaration of living on the edge had become a driving force, guiding him toward a future filled with both excitement and meaningful connections. As he looked ahead, Tony was eager to see where his journey would lead, ready to embrace the challenges and rewards that awaited him. Tony had embraced his new, recklessly adventurous life with a fervor that left little room for contemplation of his past. The thrill of his recent escapades and the euphoria of his newfound freedom had consumed him, but life, as it often does, had a way of bringing unresolved issues back into focus. It was a crisp autumn evening when Tony's past re-emerged, taking the form of an unexpected encounter. He was attending a high-profile charity gala, an event he had been invited to through his new social connections. The gala was a lavish affair, held in a grand ballroom with opulent decorations and a lively atmosphere. Tony was enjoying the evening, mingling with influential figures and reveling in the buzz of excitement. In the midst of the event, Tony's eyes were drawn to a familiar face across the room. It was Michael, his former business partner and old friend. Their falling out had been significant, a clash of ideals and values that had ultimately led to the dissolution of their partnership. The disagreement had been a painful chapter in Tony's life, and it had contributed to his decision to leave behind his old world. Seeing Michael at the gala was a jarring reminder of the unresolved tensions that had plagued Tony's past. Michael's presence was a stark contrast to the carefree persona Tony had cultivated. As they made eye contact, Tony felt a mix of emotions: anger, regret, and a simmering desire for resolution. Tony decided to approach Michael, driven by a need to confront the past and perhaps gain some closure. He wove his way through the crowd, each step laden with the weight of their shared history. When he finally reached Michael, he was met with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Tony," Michael said, his voice laced with a hint of awkwardness. It's been a while. Michael, Tony replied, his tone steady but not entirely warm. It certainly has. They exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation was charged with an underlying tension. Tony's mind raced as he tried to find the right words to express his feelings. The years of bitterness and unresolved conflict felt like a heavy burden he needed to lay down. After a few minutes of superficial conversation, Tony decided to address the issue directly. You know, seeing you here brings back a lot of memories, some good, but mostly bad. We never really got a chance to talk things through after everything fell apart. Michael's expression shifted, reflecting a mix of discomfort and defensiveness. I didn't expect to see you here, but I suppose it's fitting. We never did get the closure we needed. Tony nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. No, we didn't. I want to be clear, I don't hold any grudges anymore. I've moved on, but I think it's important that we address what happened between us. It's been a lingering shadow, and I need to face it. Michael looked away for a moment, then met Tony's gaze with a sigh. You're right. We had a falling out that left a lot of unresolved issues. I've had my share of regrets about how things ended between us. The conversation shifted to the details of their past conflicts. Tony and Michael recounted the disagreements that had driven a wedge between them, differences in business philosophy, personal values, and the eventual fallout that had strained their partnership. The discussion was honest but restrained, a reflection of their complicated history. As they spoke, Tony realized that confronting Michael was not just about resolving past grievances but also about acknowledging his own growth. The recklessness and boldness he had embraced were part of his journey to become a more self-assured individual. Facing Michael was a symbolic act of confronting the parts of his past that had shaped him. After discussing their issues, Tony and Michael reached a mutual understanding. They both acknowledged the mistakes they had made and the ways in which their actions had impacted each other. The conversation was not about assigning blame but about recognizing their shared responsibility and moving forward. As the evening drew to a close, Tony felt a sense of relief. The confrontation with Michael had been emotionally charged but ultimately cathartic. It was a crucial step in his journey of self-discovery and personal growth. He had faced a significant figure from his past, addressed the lingering tensions, and found a measure of closure. Tony and Michael parted ways with a sense of resolution. There was no expectation of rekindling their old partnership, but there was a newfound respect for the paths they had taken. Tony's encounter with Michael was a reminder that confronting the past was an essential part of moving forward. As Tony left the gala, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. The confrontation with Michael had been a challenging but necessary step in his journey. It had allowed him to face unresolved issues and gain closure, freeing him to fully embrace his new life and continue exploring the possibilities that lay ahead. Tony's newfound freedom had been liberating, but it also unveiled a side of himself that had long been suppressed. The exhilaration of his reckless adventures and the taste of living on the edge had opened the door to a darker, more primal aspect of his personality. As he continued to push boundaries and seek thrills, he found himself increasingly drawn to his darker impulses, those desires and temptations that once seemed foreign and unsettling. It started subtly. Tony found himself increasingly fascinated by the thrill of risky behaviors, activities that pushed him to the brink of danger and tested his limits. The adrenaline of high-stakes gambling and impulsive decisions had been thrilling, but there was a deeper, more alluring edge to these experiences that Tony couldn't ignore. One evening, Tony attended a clandestine party hosted by an underground organization known for its extreme pursuits. The event was shrouded in secrecy, with an exclusive guest list that included people who thrived on the thrill of the forbidden. The party was held in a dimly lit warehouse, transformed into a labyrinth of decadent indulgences and sensory overload. Tony was both intrigued and apprehensive as he entered the venue. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of danger and excitement. The guests mingled in a haze of illicit pleasures, indulging in activities that pushed the boundaries of societal norms. Tony was captivated by the allure of the scene, the way it represented a departure from conventional behavior and a dive into the unknown. As the night progressed, Tony was drawn into the more extreme aspects of the party. He participated in activities that pushed him beyond his comfort zone: drugs, provocative games, and encounters with strangers who embraced the darker side of their desires. The experience was intoxicating, a heady mix of thrill and temptation that left Tony both exhilarated and unsettled. In the days following the party, Tony's exploration of his darker impulses deepened. He began seeking out more intense experiences, driven by a desire to confront the aspects of himself that had previously been repressed. He engaged in risky behavior, such as dangerous driving, clandestine affairs, and illegal activities, all fueled by a growing fascination with the darker side of life. Tony's friends and acquaintances noticed the change in him. His once carefree demeanor had taken on a more erratic and unpredictable quality. The thrill of his new lifestyle was overshadowed by a sense of recklessness that bordered on self-destructive. The people who had once admired his boldness now grew concerned about his well-being. One evening, Tony found himself in a particularly precarious situation. He had been invited to a secretive underground fight club, where participants engaged in bare-knuckle brawls for money and glory. The environment was raw and brutal, a stark contrast to the refined, high-stakes poker games he had previously enjoyed. As Tony entered the ring for his first fight, he felt a surge of adrenaline that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The physicality of the fight, the raw aggression, and the sense of primal competition were a stark departure from his previous experiences. He fought with a ferocity that surprised even him, driven by a mix of anger, desire, and the need to confront his inner darkness. The fight left Tony bruised and battered, both physically and emotionally. The aftermath of the encounter was a sobering reminder of the consequences of embracing his darker impulses. The thrill of the fight was overshadowed by the pain and disillusionment that followed. Tony's exploration of his darker side had taken a toll on his body and mind, leaving him to grapple with the ramifications of his actions. In the solitude of his apartment, Tony reflected on his recent experiences. The dark side of his personality, which had once seemed like an exhilarating adventure, had begun to feel like a burdensome weight. The thrill of living on the edge had given way to a sense of emptiness and confusion. Tony was confronted with the realization that his pursuit of darkness was leading him down a path that was both destructive and isolating. The contrast between his newfound impulses and his previous, more restrained self became increasingly evident. Tony was torn between the exhilarating freedom of his darker pursuits and the desire to regain a sense of balance and purpose. The exploration of his darker side had revealed a complexity within him that was both alluring and unsettling. As he sat alone in his apartment, Tony faced the difficult task of reconciling the two sides of his personality. The darkness he had embraced was a powerful force, but it was also a reminder of the importance of self-awareness and control. He understood that exploring his darker impulses was a part of his journey, but it needed to be balanced with a sense of responsibility and reflection. Tony's path forward was uncertain. He had tasted the allure of the dark side, and it had left him with both a sense of fascination and a deep introspection. The thrill of his new lifestyle had come at a cost, and he needed to find a way to navigate the complexities of his desires while maintaining a sense of clarity and purpose. As he grappled with his inner conflict, Tony knew that the journey ahead would require careful consideration and self-examination. The exploration of his darker impulses had been a significant part of his transformation, but it was only one aspect of a larger journey toward understanding and self-discovery. The path forward would involve confronting his desires, seeking balance, and finding a way to integrate the various facets of his personality into a coherent and meaningful existence. Tony's descent into the darker side of life had been both thrilling and disorienting. The aftermath of his most recent escapades left him yearning for a new sense of purpose and connection. He needed allies who shared his drive for adventure and understood the complexity of his journey. As he grappled with his inner turmoil, he was drawn to a group that promised both excitement and camaraderie, an unconventional network of risk-takers who thrived on pushing boundaries and embracing the extraordinary. The opportunity to connect with this new group came through an unexpected invitation. Tony had been introduced to a charismatic and enigmatic figure named Max during one of his recent high-stakes gambling sessions. Max was known for his daring exploits and had a reputation for orchestrating elaborate and high-risk ventures. Intrigued by Max's aura of confidence and the stories he had heard, Tony was eager to learn more about the group that operated on the fringes of conventional society. The meeting was set in an exclusive, hidden venue known only to a select few. Tony arrived at the location, a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a sleek, modern space with an air of sophistication and secrecy. The ambience was electric, with dim lighting and ambient music that created an atmosphere of anticipation. As Tony entered, he was greeted by a diverse group of individuals who shared a common passion for risk-taking and adventure. The group was a blend of entrepreneurs, thrill-seekers, and renegades who thrived on pushing the limits of their experiences. Each member had their own unique skills and backgrounds, but they were united by their love for the unconventional and the extraordinary. Max, the charismatic leader of the group, welcomed Tony with a warm handshake and an easy smile. "Tony, glad you could make it. We've heard a lot about you and your recent ventures. This is the place where we turn our wildest ideas into reality." Tony felt a rush of excitement as he surveyed the room. The group's energy was infectious, and the camaraderie among its members was palpable. He quickly realized that this was a chance to immerse himself in a new world of possibilities, a world where his daring spirit could thrive. The evening unfolded with introductions and discussions about upcoming projects and adventures. The group shared tales of their recent exploits, a daring heist, a high-risk investment, and an underground racing circuit. Each story was met with a mix of admiration and excitement, and Tony found himself captivated by the sheer audacity of their pursuits. Tony was particularly drawn to a few key members of the group, Rachel, a former stunt performer turned adrenaline junkie, known for her expertise in extreme sports and her fearless attitude. She had a magnetic personality and a knack for turning even the most mundane activities into exhilarating experiences. Javier, a tech-savvy entrepreneur with a background in hacking and cybersecurity. He was the mastermind behind many of the group's high-tech ventures and had a reputation for navigating the digital world with finesse and precision. Elena, a former intelligence officer with a strategic mind and a talent for planning complex operations. Her skills in logistics and coordination made her an invaluable asset to the group's more ambitious undertakings. As the evening progressed, Tony found himself drawn into discussions about an upcoming project, a high-stakes, multifaceted operation that required a combination of daring, skill, and ingenuity. The project involved orchestrating a series of interconnected events, from infiltrating a high-security event to executing a complex financial maneuver. Tony's excitement grew as he realized that this was the kind of adventure he had been seeking. The challenge of the project was a perfect fit for his new, risk-taking persona, and he felt a strong sense of alignment with the group's ethos. He saw an opportunity to channel his energy into something both thrilling and purposeful. Max and the team welcomed Tony's enthusiasm and invited him to join the project. The collaboration promised to be a test of their collective skills and an opportunity for Tony to integrate his own talents with those of his new allies. The project was ambitious, and success would require a high level of coordination and trust among the team members. As Tony prepared to embark on this new venture, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The group of risk-takers had become more than just allies. They were a new family, united by their shared passion for the extraordinary. The challenges ahead would test their resolve and ingenuity, but Tony was eager to dive into the adventure with his newfound companions. In the days that followed, Tony and his new allies worked diligently to prepare for the project. They collaborated on strategies, rehearsed key elements of the operation, and fine-tuned their roles. The sense of teamwork and camaraderie was invigorating, and Tony felt a profound connection with the group. As the project drew closer, Tony was filled with a sense of anticipation and excitement. The opportunity to work with such a dynamic and daring team was both a challenge and a reward. He knew that the venture would push him to new heights, and he was ready to embrace the adventure with open arms. Tony's journey with his new allies marked a turning point in his life. The group represented a new chapter in his quest for freedom and self-discovery, a chapter filled with daring exploits, meaningful connections, and the promise of extraordinary experiences. As he embarked on this new adventure, Tony was ready to face the challenges ahead and explore the boundless possibilities that lay before him. Tony's immersion into the world of high-stakes risk-taking had reached its zenith with the ambitious heist planned by his new allies. The heist was not just an opportunity for adventure, it was a complex operation requiring precision, skill, and impeccable timing. The target was a high-profile gala, hosted at a renowned museum with a reputation for showcasing priceless art. The event was a perfect setting for a daring heist, an opulent venue filled with valuable artifacts, security systems, and an elite guest list. In the weeks leading up to the heist, Tony and his team worked meticulously on every detail. Max led the planning with his characteristic charisma and strategic acumen. Rachel, with her background in stunt performance, devised a series of daring maneuvers that would allow them to navigate the high-security environment. Javier's expertise in technology was crucial for hacking into the museum's security systems and disabling alarms. Elena coordinated the logistical aspects of the operation, ensuring that each team member knew their role and that every contingency was accounted for. The heist would start with Tony and Rachel infiltrating the gala as guests. Their task was to blend in with the elite crowd, gather intelligence, and create distractions when needed. Their cover was a carefully crafted persona, Tony as a wealthy investor and Rachel as his glamorous companion. Javier would be stationed at a remote location, using his skills to breach the museum's security network. His role was to disable cameras, alarms, and motion sensors, ensuring that the team could move freely within the museum. Once inside, Tony and Rachel would make their way to the secured rooms where the most valuable artifacts were displayed. Their objective was to retrieve a set of rare and highly coveted pieces of art. Elena would oversee the extraction phase, coordinating the team's movements and ensuring that they could exit the museum without raising suspicion. A series of timed diversions and precise maneuvers would ensure that they evaded capture. The night of the heist arrived, and the team was abuzz with anticipation. The museum was transformed into a dazzling spectacle for the gala: crystal chandeliers, elegant decorations, and a glittering array of guests. Tony and Rachel arrived at the venue, their sophisticated attire blending seamlessly with the opulent surroundings. Tony's role was to engage with key guests and gather information about the museum's layout and security. He used his charm and wit to strike up conversations with influential figures, subtly probing for details that could aid the heist. Meanwhile, Rachel moved through the crowd with grace, her sharp eyes and keen instincts allowing her to identify potential obstacles and opportunities. Javier's preparations were underway from his remote location. His hacking skills were put to the test as he breached the museum's security systems, working swiftly to bypass firewalls and encryption. The tension in the air was palpable as he executed the plan, each keystroke bringing him closer to disabling the security measures. Once Javier confirmed that the systems were down, Tony and Rachel made their move. They navigated the museum's labyrinthine corridors, using their knowledge of the layout to avoid the few remaining security personnel. The team's meticulous planning paid off as they reached the secured rooms without incident. Inside the rooms, Tony and Rachel worked quickly and efficiently. Tony used his skills to disable the physical security measures, while Rachel carefully handled the valuable artifacts, ensuring that they were packed and ready for extraction. The operation required precision and calm under pressure, and both Tony and Rachel performed their tasks with practiced ease. As the heist reached its climax, Elena coordinated the team's movements with a masterful sense of timing. She orchestrated a series of diversions, small, controlled incidents that drew attention away from their activities and allowed them to move undetected. The extraction phase was a high-stakes race against time, but the team executed their plan flawlessly. Tony and Rachel emerged from the museum, their mission accomplished. They joined Elena and the rest of the team at the designated extraction point, where a sleek getaway vehicle awaited. The exhilaration of their success was palpable, and the team celebrated their achievement with a mixture of relief and triumph. The heist had been a resounding success, a testament to the team's skill, coordination, and daring. The valuable artifacts were safely secured, and the operation had gone off without a hitch. Tony's participation in the heist had pushed him to new heights, testing his abilities and reaffirming his place within the group. As they regrouped and debriefed, Tony reflected on the experience. The heist had been a thrilling and transformative adventure, a culmination of his journey into the world of risk-taking and exploration. It had tested his limits, challenged his perceptions, and reinforced his sense of belonging within his new circle of allies. The heist marked a significant milestone in Tony's journey, a bold statement of his commitment to embracing the extraordinary and confronting the darker aspects of his personality. It was a reminder that his path was not just about seeking thrills but also about finding purpose and connection in the midst of chaos. As the team celebrated their success, Tony knew that their journey was far from over. The heist had opened new doors and presented new opportunities, and he was eager to continue exploring the boundless possibilities that lay ahead. The world of high-stakes risk-taking had become an integral part of his life, and Tony was ready to embrace the challenges and adventures that awaited him. The euphoria from the successful heist had barely faded when Tony began to sense the weight of the consequences that his reckless lifestyle had brought upon him. The thrill of the adventure had been intoxicating, but the aftermath was starting to unravel in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. As he reveled in the glory of the heist, cracks began to show in the facade of his new world, leading Tony to confront the fallout of his actions. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a series of unexpected encounters. Tony was approached by a shadowy figure who claimed to be a private investigator hired by an unknown client. The investigator was discreet and professional, but the message was clear: someone was probing into Tony's recent activities. The ominous nature of the encounter left Tony uneasy, a stark reminder that their high-profile heist had attracted unwanted attention. The second indication of trouble was more personal. Tony's relationship with his new allies, while initially strong, began to show signs of strain. The team's success had fostered a sense of competition and jealousy among some members. Max, who had been the charismatic leader, started to exhibit erratic behavior, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Tensions within the group became palpable, and small disagreements escalated into heated arguments. Tony's personal life was also affected by the fallout. The exhilaration of his new lifestyle had come at the cost of estranging him from old friends and family. Attempts to reconnect with them were met with skepticism and coldness. The friends who had once admired Tony's ambition were now concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior and risky decisions. Family members, who had initially been worried about his grief, now saw him as a person who had lost touch with his former self. In addition, Tony began to experience mounting financial pressures. The proceeds from the heist, while substantial, were not enough to shield him from the fallout of his extravagant spending. The costs of maintaining his new lifestyle, coupled with the need to keep a low profile, began to take their toll. Tony found himself in a precarious financial situation, struggling to balance his lavish expenses with the need for discretion. The tipping point came when a police investigation into the museum heist began to heat up. Despite their careful planning and execution, the team had left behind a few clues that law enforcement was now piecing together. The police had identified the heist as a highly sophisticated operation, and their investigation was narrowing in on Tony and his allies. The pressure was mounting, and the risk of arrest became an ever-present reality. The situation came to a head during a tense meeting with the group. The team was gathered to discuss their next steps and strategies for dealing with the increasing scrutiny. Max, who had previously been a source of inspiration and leadership, had become increasingly erratic and defensive. The pressure of the investigation and the internal discord led to a heated argument, culminating in Max's abrupt decision to sever ties with Tony and the others. Feeling the weight of his decisions and the crumbling stability of his life, Tony sought solace in the one remaining source of comfort, his memories of his wife. He revisited the places they had cherished together, seeking a connection to his past self and a sense of grounding amidst the chaos. It was during these moments of reflection that Tony grappled with the realization of how far he had strayed from the person he once was. The confrontation came unexpectedly. Tony was approached by Rachel, one of his closest allies, who expressed her concerns about the direction of their actions. She had seen the toll that the heist and the subsequent fallout had taken on Tony and the team. Rachel's confrontation was a mixture of compassion and frustration, a wake-up call that Tony could no longer ignore. The fallout of Tony's actions forced him to confront the consequences of his decisions. The thrill of the heist had led to a whirlwind of unintended repercussions, strained relationships, mounting pressures, and the threat of legal consequences. Tony was faced with a critical decision: to continue down the path of reckless abandon or to reassess his choices and seek a path to redemption. As Tony grappled with the fallout, he was also forced to consider the impact of his actions on those around him. The camaraderie and excitement of the heist had been exhilarating, but the aftermath revealed a more sobering reality. The consequences of his decisions were affecting not just his own life, but the lives of those he cared about. In the wake of the fallout, Tony began to seek a path to redemption. He reached out to those he had estranged, attempting to repair damaged relationships and make amends for his actions. The journey toward redemption was fraught with challenges, but Tony was determined to confront the consequences of his choices and find a way to rebuild his life. Tony's story had come full circle. The exhilaration of the heist had been a transformative experience, but the fallout revealed the complexities of living on the edge. The path to redemption was a difficult and uncertain one, but it was a journey that Tony was ready to undertake. As he faced the consequences of his actions, he sought to reconcile his past with his present and find a way to navigate the turbulent waters of his new reality. The fallout from the heist was only the beginning of Tony's troubles. As he tried to navigate the complexities of his new life, he found himself crossing paths with someone far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated, a rival whose intentions were as deadly as they were mysterious. Tony's introduction to this new enemy came during what he had initially assumed to be a routine errand. He had been meeting with Offense, one of the few people he trusted to offload some of the stolen art from the heist. The meeting took place in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where deals were made and secrets were kept. But as Tony and the Fence discussed the details, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A group of men entered the warehouse, their presence immediately imposing. At the head of the group was a tall, enigmatic figure who exuded a chilling calmness. The Fence's demeanor changed instantly, fear replaced his usual confidence, and he became visibly nervous. The man introduced himself as Victor, a name that sent a cold shiver down Tony's spine, even though he had never heard it before. There was something in Victor's eyes, a cold and calculating intelligence that made it clear he was not to be trifled with. Victor wasted no time in asserting his dominance. He informed Tony that the stolen art belonged to him now, and any attempt to sell it would result in severe consequences. Tony, never one to back down from a challenge, tried to stand his ground. But Victor's men were quick to close in, their presence a silent threat. The fence, who had been Tony's ally moments ago, now cowered before Victor, agreeing to his demands without hesitation. Tony realized he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and for the first time since his descent into this new life, he felt a sense of real danger. Victor didn't just take the art, he left Tony with a warning. He explained that the heist had disrupted a delicate balance of power in the criminal underworld, and that Tony's actions had put him on the radar of powerful and ruthless individuals. Victor made it clear that he was one of those individuals, a man who thrived on chaos and controlled it with an iron fist. Victor's message was simple: Tony was playing a dangerous game, and if he continued down this path, he would inevitably become a target. The art was only the beginning. Victor hinted at much larger stakes, and much deadlier consequences. After the encounter, Tony couldn't shake the feeling of unease that Victor had left him with. He knew that he needed to learn more about this new enemy if he was going to survive. Tony reached out to his remaining contacts, digging into the criminal underworld for any information on Victor. What he uncovered was chilling. Victor was not just a rival, he was a force of nature within the criminal world. His reputation was built on a foundation of ruthlessness and precision. Victor had risen to power through a series of calculated moves, eliminating rivals and consolidating his influence with an almost surgical efficiency. His operations spanned various illegal activities, from arms dealing to high-stakes heists, and his network of loyal enforcers was vast and formidable. Tony realized that Victor was not someone who could be easily outmaneuvered or intimidated. This was a man who thrived on conflict, who relished the opportunity to crush anyone who challenged him. The stakes had just been raised, and Tony knew he was in for the fight of his life. Tony's encounter with Victor marked the beginning of a deadly rivalry. He was no longer just dealing with the fallout from the heist, now he was facing a powerful adversary who would stop at nothing to assert his dominance. The rules of the game had changed, and Tony had to adapt quickly if he wanted to survive. Victor wasted no time in making his presence felt. Over the following weeks, Tony found himself targeted in ways he hadn't expected. First, his financial assets were compromised, bank accounts drained, investments sabotaged, and business deals ruined. Victor's reach was extensive, and he used it to systematically dismantle Tony's resources. Then came the physical threats. Tony's home was broken into, his belongings trashed, and ominous messages left behind. Friends and associates who had remained loyal to him were harassed, their lives threatened if they continued to support him. Victor's tactics were designed to isolate Tony, to strip away his support system and leave him vulnerable. Despite these setbacks, Tony refused to back down. The defiance that had led him to embrace his new life now fueled his determination to fight back. He knew that if he showed any sign of weakness, Victor would destroy him completely. But if he could find a way to outthink his enemy, to turn the tables, there was a chance he could not only survive but emerge stronger. Tony decided that the only way to confront Victor was to strike back, to show that he wasn't afraid and that he was willing to fight for his life. He began by gathering intelligence on Victor's operations, looking for any vulnerabilities he could exploit. With the help of Rachel and Javier, who had remained loyal despite the risks, Tony planned a counterstrike, a bold move to disrupt one of Victor's key operations. The target was a shipment of arms that Victor was moving through the city, a critical part of his empire that Tony intended to hit hard. The operation was risky, and the chances of success were slim, but Tony knew that he needed to send a message to Victor that he was not going to be easily defeated. The night of the operation was tense, every moment fraught with the possibility of failure. But Tony's team executed their plan with precision, hitting the shipment and crippling a key part of Victor's operation. It was a small victory, but it was enough to shake Victor's confidence and show him that Tony was a formidable opponent. Victor's response was swift and brutal. He escalated his efforts to crush Tony, launching a series of attacks that pushed Tony to his limits. The rivalry between the two men became a deadly game of cat and mouse, each trying to outmaneuver the other in a battle of wits and strength. Tony knew that the stakes had never been higher. He was no longer just fighting for survival, he was fighting to reclaim his life from the darkness that had consumed it. The confrontation with Victor had forced him to confront the man he had become, to acknowledge the consequences of his actions and the path he had chosen. As the rivalry between Tony and Victor escalated, Tony realized that this was not just a fight for control, but a battle for his very soul. The journey that had begun with the loss of his wife had led him to this moment, a confrontation with a powerful enemy that would define his future. Tony was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that only one of them would emerge victorious. Tony's life had taken a sharp turn after the confrontation with Victor. The lines between who he once was and who he had become were blurring beyond recognition. As he plunged deeper into the underworld, the last remnants of his old self started to fade away, replaced by a man consumed by danger, power, and a thirst for control. The further Tony descended into this new life, the more his moral compass began to disintegrate. What had started as acts of defiance now evolved into a willingness to do whatever it took to survive and thrive in this ruthless world. Tony found himself making decisions he never would have considered before, betraying old allies, lying, stealing, and even taking lives without hesitation. That he no longer saw people as friends or foes, but as pawns in a game that he was determined to win. The grief that had once torn at his heart was now a distant memory, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Tony had come to terms with his wife's death not by finding peace, but by embracing the chaos that had followed. The pain had fueled his transformation, pushing him further down a path from which there was no return. Tony's spiral was driven by a newfound addiction, an addiction to power. The more he tasted it, the more he craved it. Every victory, every successful move against Victor or anyone who stood in his way, fed his desire for more. He no longer cared about the risks, in fact, the danger only heightened the thrill. This addiction led Tony to take increasingly reckless actions. He began expanding his operations, moving into territories that had once been controlled by others. He formed alliances with dangerous individuals, men and women who lived by the same ruthless code that he had adopted. Together, they built a network that spread fear and commanded respect, but with every step forward, Tony sank deeper into the darkness. The power he sought came at a price, one that he paid with his humanity. The more he gained, the more he lost: trust, loyalty, and the ability to connect with anyone on a genuine level. His world was now one of deception and violence, a world where every relationship was a transaction, and every decision carried the potential for betrayal. As Tony spiraled further into his new life, he found himself increasingly isolated. The people who had once cared about him, friends, family, even Rachel and Javier, began to drift away. Some feared him, others couldn't recognize the man he had become, and still others were pushed away by Tony himself, who saw attachments as weaknesses. Rachel, who had been his closest confidant in the early days of his transformation, was now a distant figure. The bond they had shared was strained by Tony's obsession with power and control. She had tried to reach out to him, to pull him back from the edge, but Tony's response was cold and dismissive. He didn't need anyone, he told her, and that included her. Javier, too, began to question his loyalty to Tony. The man who had once been his partner in crime was now a volatile force, driven by impulses that were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Javier stayed out of a sense of duty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Tony was heading toward a self-destructive end. The isolation only fueled Tony's descent. Without anyone to anchor him, he became more detached from reality, more willing to cross lines that even he would have considered sacred before. He was no longer just a man who had lost his wife, he was a man who had lost himself, and in his place stood someone who was willing to burn the world down if it meant feeling something, anything, in the void that had replaced his heart. The descent reached its critical point when Tony made a decision that he knew would mark the point of no return. It wasn't just another calculated risk or a step deeper into the criminal world, it was an act that would seal his fate. Tony orchestrated an attack on Victor's most secure and profitable operation, a move that was as bold as it was reckless. The plan was flawless in its execution, a testament to the meticulous strategist that Tony had become. But it was also an act of pure defiance, a declaration that Tony was not just surviving in this world, but that he was determined to dominate it. The attack was successful, but the cost was high. Innocent lives were lost, collateral damage in a war that Tony had chosen to escalate. For the first time, he was faced with the consequences of his actions not just on himself, but on others who had nothing to do with his vendetta against Victor. Yet, instead of feeling remorse, Tony felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The power, the control, the knowledge that he could dictate the fates of others, it was intoxicating. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and in doing so, he had finally embraced the person he had become. Tony's descent was complete. He was no longer the man he had been before his wife's death, nor was he the man who had hesitated at the thought of breaking the law or taking a life. He had become something else entirely, a figure who operated in the shadows, feared by those who knew his name, and driven by a need to assert his will on a world that had once seemed so uncontrollable. The abyss that Tony had fallen into was deep and dark, and there was no turning back. He had chosen this path, and now he was determined to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The man who had once lived a peaceful, routine life was gone, replaced by a force of nature that moved with purpose and without hesitation. As Tony looked at the world around him, he realized that he had finally found the freedom he had been searching for, a freedom that came not from escaping his past, but from fully embracing the darkness within. The descent was complete, but the journey was far from over. Tony was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the only way out was through, and that he was willing to go as far as it took to see his new life through to its ultimate conclusion. Tony's new life, fueled by risk and rebellion, had brought him a sense of control he'd never known before. Surrounded by a group of daring allies, he felt invincible. But in the world Tony had entered, trust was a rare commodity, and loyalty was often a matter of convenience rather than conviction. The cracks in his newfound circle were inevitable, and when they appeared, the betrayal would cut deeper than any external threat. The first signs of trouble were subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider. Tony's inner circle, once tight-knit and aligned in their ambitions, began to show signs of strain. Disagreements became more frequent, decisions were questioned, and the once clear lines of authority started to blur. Tony noticed the changes but dismissed them as the natural friction of working in a high-stakes environment. He had underestimated the consequences of these growing tensions. One of Tony's closest allies, a man named Marcus, began to distance himself from the group. Marcus had been instrumental in several of Tony's most daring operations, his cool demeanor and sharp mind making him a valuable asset. But lately, Marcus seemed distracted, his loyalty wavering in ways that Tony couldn't quite put his finger on. There were whispered conversations that stopped when Tony entered the room, and plans that were suddenly altered without his input. Tony, driven by his newfound confidence and the belief that he could control any situation, chose to ignore these warning signs. He had faced down enemies far more dangerous than internal discord, and he was confident that whatever was brewing, he could handle it. But the seeds of betrayal had already been sown, and they were beginning to take root. The betrayal was orchestrated with chilling precision, a plan that Marcus had been working on in secret for weeks. He had grown disillusioned with Tony's leadership, believing that the reckless path Tony was on would inevitably lead them all to ruin. Marcus had seen enough in his time to know that Tony's addiction to power and control would eventually spiral out of control, and he wasn't willing to go down with him. Marcus began to align himself with one of Tony's rivals, a figure who had been watching Tony's rise with growing concern. Together, they plotted to undermine Tony's operations, gradually eroding his influence and setting the stage for a takeover. The plan was simple: lure Tony into a situation where he was vulnerable, expose him, and then seize control of everything he had built. The opportunity came when Tony decided to go after a new target, a high-risk, high-reward operation that promised to solidify his dominance in the underworld. Marcus, who had always been the voice of reason in the group, surprisingly supported the plan, offering to take the lead in the operation. Tony, eager to prove himself once again, accepted without hesitation, not realizing that he was walking into a carefully laid trap. On the day of the operation, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Tony and his team moved in with their usual precision, but as the heist progressed, something felt off. The security was tighter than expected, and the police response was unusually fast. It was as if someone had tipped them off, but Tony couldn't believe that anyone in his circle would dare betray him. As the situation deteriorated, Tony's suspicions grew. When they reached the final stage of the heist, Marcus suddenly disappeared, leaving Tony and the others to fend for themselves. In the chaos that followed, Tony realized the extent of the betrayal. Marcus had not only abandoned them but had also sabotaged the operation from within, ensuring that they would be caught in a deadly crossfire. Tony's mind raced as he fought to escape, the realization hitting him like a cold wave. He had been outplayed, not by an enemy from the outside, but by someone he had trusted with his life. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, and it cut deeper than any wound Tony had ever received. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to stay one step ahead, but Marcus had blindsided him, exploiting the very weaknesses that Tony had tried so hard to bury. In the aftermath of the betrayal, Tony barely escaped with his life. His team was shattered, some captured, others killed, and the operation was a complete failure. The loss was staggering, not just in terms of money or power, but in the damage to Tony's reputation. Word spread quickly in the underworld that Tony had been betrayed, and his enemies sensed blood in the water. Tony's mind was a storm of anger, regret, and a burning need for revenge. The betrayal had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the reality of the life he had chosen. The power and control he had sought now seemed like illusions, fragile constructs that could be torn apart by a single act of treachery. But Tony was not a man who would go down easily. The betrayal had hurt him, but it had also hardened him, pushing him further into the darkness. He swore to make Marcus pay, to hunt him down and exact a vengeance so brutal that no one would ever dare cross him again. The game had changed, and Tony was ready to play by the new rules, rules that would demand a new level of ruthlessness, one that would leave no room for mercy or forgiveness. As Tony plotted his next move, he realized that the betrayal had taught him a valuable lesson. In this world, there were no friends, only allies of convenience, and trust was a weakness that could be exploited. Tony knew that to survive, he would need to become even more calculating, more unforgiving, and more willing to do whatever it took to stay on top. The descent into his new life was now complete. Tony had crossed every line, broken every tie, and burned every bridge. There was no going back, only forward, into a future where betrayal was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. Tony was ready for it, prepared to face whatever came his way with the same devil-may-care attitude that had brought him this far. But as he looked at the shattered remnants of his once powerful operation, Tony knew that the cost of this lesson had been high, perhaps too high. The man he had once been was gone, and in his place was someone who had lost everything, including the ability to trust. The path forward was clear, but it was also darker than ever, a path that Tony would walk alone, guided only by the burning need to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Tony's life had become a whirlwind of chaos, betrayal, and relentless pursuit of power. The events that had unfolded since his wife's death had transformed him into someone he barely recognized, a man driven by anger, revenge, and a reckless need to assert his dominance. But as the dust settled after the betrayal, Tony found himself standing at a crossroads, facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. Tony's betrayal at the hands of Marcus had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. The heist had been a disaster, and Tony was forced to retreat into the shadows, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. His once formidable crew was now fractured, his influence weakened, and his enemies emboldened. The world Tony had fought so hard to control was slipping through his fingers, and he knew that his next move would be critical. In the weeks following the betrayal, Tony became increasingly isolated. He cut off contact with the few remaining allies he had left, unwilling to trust anyone. His days were spent in a haze of anger and regret, his nights haunted by the memory of his wife and the life they had shared. The man who had once thrived on risk and danger was now consumed by a gnawing sense of emptiness, but amid the darkness, a spark of clarity began to emerge. Tony realized that he could no longer continue down this path, that something had to change. The pursuit of power and revenge had brought him nothing but pain and loss, and the more he fought to hold on, the more he felt himself slipping away. Tony knew he was at a turning point, and the decision he made now would determine whether he would continue to spiral into darkness or find a way back to the light. It was during this period of introspection that Tony received an unexpected visitor, an old friend from his past, someone who had known him before his life had taken its dark turn. This friend, a man named Frank, had heard about Tony's recent troubles and had come to offer him a way out. Frank had left the criminal world years ago, choosing to build a legitimate business and distance himself from the violence and chaos that had once defined his life. He had seen what the pursuit of power had done to Tony and others like him, and he believed that Tony still had a chance to change course. Frank offered Tony a position in his company, a way to leave the criminal world behind and start anew. The offer was tempting. For the first time in months, Tony saw a glimmer of hope, a way out of the mess he had created, a chance to rebuild his life and perhaps even find peace. But the decision was not an easy one. Accepting Frank's offer would mean giving up everything he had fought for, abandoning the life he had built, and walking away from the power and control that had become his obsession. Tony spent days wrestling with the decision. On one hand, he was tired of the violence, the betrayal, the endless cycle of revenge and retribution. The idea of a peaceful life, free from the constant danger and paranoia, was appealing. But on the other hand, Tony was not sure he could let go of the man he had become. The power, the thrill of the chase, the feeling of invincibility, these were things he had come to crave, things that had filled the void left by his wife's death. As Tony weighed his options, he found himself returning to the memory of his wife. He thought about the life they had shared, the dreams they had once had, and the promises he had made to her. He wondered what she would think of the man he had become, and whether she would want him to continue down this path. In the end, it was this reflection that brought Tony to his decision. He realized that he could not continue to live in the shadow of his wife's death, that the path he was on would only lead to more pain and loss. The time had come to let go of the past, to stop chasing ghosts, and to find a way to move forward. Tony accepted Frank's offer. The decision to leave his old life behind was not easy, and the transition was far from smooth. Tony's enemies did not simply disappear, and there were those who saw his decision as a sign of weakness. But Tony was determined. He cut ties with his criminal associates, severed connections to his former life, and focused on rebuilding himself from the ground up. The first steps were the hardest. Tony had to learn how to live without the constant adrenaline rush, without the power and control he had once wielded. But as time passed, he began to find a sense of peace he had not known in years. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer Tony, the ruthless criminal. He was just Tony, a man trying to rebuild his life. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Tony felt a sense of hope. He knew that the journey would be long and difficult, that there would be moments of doubt and temptation. But he also knew that he had made the right choice, that the turning point in his life had been a necessary one. As Tony looked forward to the future, He knew that he could never fully escape his past, that the man he had been would always be a part of him. But he was no longer defined by that man. He was something more, a man who had faced the darkness and come out the other side, ready to embrace whatever came next. The turning point had come, and Tony was ready to walk the path he had chosen, no matter where it led. Tony had made his decision to leave his old life behind, but the past has a way of lingering, especially when it's steeped in blood, betrayal, and unfinished business. Despite his best efforts to move on, Tony soon discovered that the life he once led wasn't something he could simply walk away from. The ghosts of his past were not content to remain buried, and they began to resurface, threatening to drag him back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. It began with a series of unsettling reminders. Late one night, Tony received an anonymous package at his new address. Inside was a single, unmarked photograph, a picture of Tony and his wife, taken years ago at a moment of happiness that now felt like a lifetime ago. The photo was accompanied by a simple message: "You can't outrun your past." The message shook Tony to his core. He had taken great care to leave no trace of his new life, cutting ties with everyone from his past, yet someone had found him. The photograph was more than just a threat, it was a reminder of everything Tony had lost, of the life he had once lived and the people he had crossed. It was a warning that the past was not finished with him. As the days passed, more reminders followed. Tony began to receive phone calls in the middle of the night, the caller silent on the other end. Old acquaintances from his former life started appearing in unexpected places, at his workplace, outside his home, never approaching, but always watching. It was clear that someone wanted Tony to know that his past was catching up with him, and they were not going to let him walk away so easily. One evening, as Tony was returning home from work, he noticed a familiar figure lurking in the shadows. It was one of his former associates, a man named Vincent, who had once been part of Tony's inner circle. Vincent had a reputation for being ruthless and unforgiving, and the look in his eyes told Tony everything he needed to know. Vincent had unfinished business with him. Unable to ignore the threat any longer, Tony confronted Vincent in a secluded alleyway. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with unresolved animosity. Vincent wasted no time in making his intentions clear. He wanted revenge for the betrayal that had fractured their crew and nearly cost him his life. He blamed Tony for everything that had gone wrong and was determined to make him pay. Tony tried to reason with Vincent, explaining that he had left that life behind and had no interest in reigniting old conflicts. But Vincent was not swayed. He had lost too much because of Tony's actions, and forgiveness was not something he was willing to offer. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Vincent making it clear that he would stop at nothing to destroy everything Tony had rebuilt. The encounter with Vincent stirred up memories Tony had tried to bury. He remembered the deals gone wrong, the betrayals, and the violence that had defined his life after his wife's death. He thought of the people he had hurt, the friends he had lost, and the enemies he had made along the way. The ghosts of his past were not just in the form of people, they were the memories that haunted him, the guilt that gnawed at him, and the fear that he could never truly escape the darkness. Tony began to feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, threatening to pull him back into the life he had tried to leave behind. The peace he had found was fragile, and the ghosts of his past were determined to shatter it. The lines between the man he had become and the man he used to be began to blur, and Tony found himself questioning whether he could ever truly change. Realizing that the ghosts of his past would not go away on their own, Tony made a decision: he would confront them head-on. He could not allow his past to dictate his future, and he refused to let fear control his life. Tony knew that this would not be an easy fight, and that there were risks involved, but he also knew that he could not continue to live in the shadow of his former self. Tony began to take steps to protect himself, reaching out to the few remaining allies he could trust and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Vincent and anyone else who sought to drag him back into the criminal world. He knew that this would be a defining moment, a test of his resolve to stay on the path he had chosen. As Tony prepared for the battle ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of his past were more than just people and memories; they were a part of him. The darkness that had consumed him after his wife's death was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to take control again, but Tony was determined to face these ghosts, to confront the man he used to be, and to prove that he could rise above the darkness. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger, and there were no guarantees of success, but Tony knew that he had no choice. The only way to truly escape the past was to confront it, no matter how painful or terrifying it might be. As Tony stood on the brink of another turning point in his life, he knew that the ghosts of his past would not be easily vanquished. But he was ready to fight, to reclaim his life, and to finally lay those ghosts to rest. The air was thick with tension as Tony prepared for the inevitable showdown with his new rival. Ever since the ghosts of his past had re-emerged, Tony had been on high alert, knowing that it was only a matter of time before a confrontation would come. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle that lay ahead would determine whether Tony could truly escape his past or if he would be dragged back into the abyss. Tony's new rival, Victor, was not just another enemy. He was a dangerous and calculating man who had been watching Tony from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Victor was different from the others Tony had faced. He was patient, methodical, and had a deep understanding of Tony's weaknesses. He knew how to exploit the cracks in Tony's armor, and he had been slowly chipping away at them, waiting for Tony to make a mistake. In the days leading up to the confrontation, Tony received several warnings from those still loyal to him. Victor was amassing resources, gathering allies, and planning something big. Tony could feel the noose tightening around him, but he refused to back down. He knew that running was not an option. If he fled now, he would be running for the rest of his life. The confrontation was set to take place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where Tony had conducted business in his darker days. It was a fitting location, one that echoed with the memories of deals made and lives lost. Tony chose the location himself, knowing that he needed the advantage of familiar territory. He arrived early, accompanied by a few trusted allies, and began preparing for the encounter. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor, Tony's thoughts turned to the journey that had led him here. He had made many mistakes, crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and hurt people he cared about. But he had also fought to change, to be more than just the sum of his worst actions. This confrontation felt like the culmination of everything he had been through, a final test of whether he could truly leave his past behind. Victor arrived as the last light of day faded away, stepping into the warehouse with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He was flanked by several men, each one as cold and calculating as their leader. Victor's eyes met Tony's across the empty space, and for a moment, neither man moved. The silence was deafening, the tension almost unbearable. Tony knew that this was not just a battle for survival, it was a battle for his future. Victor represented everything Tony had tried to escape: ruthlessness, power, control, and now, that past was staring him down, challenging him to a fight he could not afford to lose. The confrontation began with words, each man trying to assert dominance over the other. Victor taunted Tony, reminding him of the lives he had destroyed, the bridges he had burned, and the darkness that still lurked within him. He painted a picture of Tony as a man doomed to repeat his past mistakes, a man who could never truly escape the life he had once led. But Tony was no longer the man he used to be. He had faced his demons, confronted his fears, and made a conscious decision to change. He knew that he could not be goaded into losing control, that this was exactly what Victor wanted. Instead of rising to the bait, Tony remained calm, focused, and determined to end this on his terms. The tension finally snapped as the first punch was thrown, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. The fight was brutal, with both sides evenly matched in strength and resolve. Tony fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that his future depended on the outcome of this battle. Every punch, every move, was calculated, but there was also a raw intensity driving him forward, an unwillingness to let Victor take away everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. As the fight raged on, it became clear that this was not just a physical battle, it was a psychological one as well. Victor tried to break Tony's spirit, to make him doubt himself and give in to the darkness. But Tony had come too far, endured too much, to let himself be defeated. He fought with everything he had, drawing on the strength he had found in his journey of self-discovery. The turning point came when Tony managed to disarm Victor, pinning him to the ground. With Victor at his mercy, Tony faced a choice. He could end it all here, in the same ruthless way he had dealt with threats in the past, or he could choose a different path, a path that would finally break the cycle of violence and revenge. Tony hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy in his mind. The old Tony would not have thought twice about what to do next. But this was a different Tony, a man who had fought to change, who had learned the hard way that power and control were not the answers to his pain. In that moment, Tony made his choice that he let Victor go. Victor's defeat was not in his death, but in the fact that Tony had risen above the need for revenge. Tony's mercy was the ultimate victory, a sign that he had truly left his old life behind. Victor, stunned by Tony's decision, could do nothing but retreat, knowing that he had lost in more ways than one. As Victor and his men disappeared into the night, Tony stood alone in the empty warehouse, the echoes of the confrontation fading away. He knew that the battle was over, but the journey was not. The ghosts of his past would always be there, but they no longer had the power to control him. Tony had faced his greatest challenge and emerged victorious, not because he had defeated his enemy, but because he had defeated the darkness within himself. The confrontation had been a test of his resolve, and he had passed. Now, as he walked out of the warehouse and into the night, Tony felt a sense of peace, knowing that he was finally free. As Tony walked away from the confrontation with Victor, the weight of his decisions began to settle on his shoulders. The sense of victory he felt was quickly tempered by the cold reality of what his new life truly cost him. The path he had chosen, one of defiance, recklessness, and breaking free from his past, was not without consequences, and now, those consequences were becoming painfully clear. Tony's newfound freedom came at a steep price: isolation. The more he pushed away the remnants of his old life, the more he found himself alone. The friends who once stood by him had either been cut off or driven away by his radical transformation. The connections that once grounded him, the people who had tried to support him in his grief, were now distant memories. In the beginning, Tony had relished his independence, embracing the solitude as a form of liberation. But now, as he sat in his empty apartment, the silence was deafening. The thrill of his recent victories, defeating Victor, escaping the clutches of his past, was fading, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that he couldn't shake. Tony's reckless decisions also came with financial repercussions. The heist he had orchestrated had brought in money, but it had also attracted unwanted attention. The law was closing in on him, and Tony found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the moment when his past actions would catch up to him. The money he had acquired was slowly slipping through his fingers, spent on covering his tracks, paying off debts, and trying to maintain the illusion of control. The high-stakes lifestyle he had adopted required a constant flow of cash, and Tony was beginning to realize that he was running out of options. The more he tried to hold on, the more it felt like everything was slipping away. Tony's relationship with his remaining allies was also fraying. The betrayal he had suffered had left him distrustful, and that distrust was poisoning his interactions with those who were still loyal to him. Every conversation was tinged with suspicion, every gesture scrutinized for hidden motives. The camaraderie that had once bonded them was eroding, replaced by a cold, transactional dynamic that left Tony feeling more alone than ever. His impulsive decisions were alienating those who once believed in him. They began to see him not as a leader or a partner, but as a liability, a man who had become too unpredictable, too dangerous to be associated with. Tony could sense their growing unease, but he was too far gone to change course. The very attitude that had given him a taste of freedom was now the same attitude that was driving everyone away. The physical toll of Tony's new life was also becoming undeniable. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, and the adrenaline-fueled lifestyle were wearing him down. He had always prided himself on his resilience, but even he could feel his body beginning to give out. The bruises and injuries from his confrontations were taking longer to heal, and the exhaustion was creeping into every aspect of his life. Emotionally, Tony was a wreck. The thrill of rebellion had given way to a deep-seated anxiety that he couldn't escape. The more risks he took, the more he realized how fragile his life had become. He had built his new identity on the ashes of his old one, but now, it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath him. The ghosts of his past were no longer just haunting him, they were tearing him apart from the inside. One night, as Tony sat alone in his apartment, nursing a drink and staring out at the city skyline, he was struck by a moment of clarity. He had fought so hard to break free from the pain of losing his wife, to escape the mundane life he had once led. But in doing so, he had lost himself in the process. The price of his freedom was the very thing he had been trying to avoid: loneliness, regret, and the realization that he had traded one prison for another, Tony knew that he couldn't continue down this path without losing everything, what little he had left of himself. The cost of his freedom was too high, and he was beginning to wonder if it had all been worth it. The defiance, the risks, the battles, it had all led him to this point, but now, he was questioning whether this was the life he truly wanted. As the night wore on, Tony found himself at a crossroads. He could continue on this path, embracing the chaos and letting it consume him, or he could try to find a way back, a way to rebuild, to reconnect, to find a new purpose that wasn't driven by anger and grief. The choice was his, but it was one that would define the rest of his life. The price of freedom, Tony realized, was not just the loss of his old life, but the loss of himself. And as he sat there, contemplating his next move, he knew that whatever decision he made, it would come with its own set of consequences. The only question was whether he was willing to pay the price. Tony stood at the edge of everything he had built, staring into the abyss. The weight of his decisions bore down on him, but rather than retreat, he felt a surge of adrenaline, pushing him to take one last, desperate risk. This gamble would either solidify his new life or destroy everything he had left. The stakes had never been higher, and Tony knew that this final move would define his fate. Tony's mind raced as he devised his final plan, a high-stakes operation that would either secure his freedom or end in his downfall. He had nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous than ever. The plan was audacious, a culmination of everything he had learned in his spiral into the criminal underworld. He would go after the one thing that could set him free from the mess he had created, a massive score, one that would allow him to disappear forever. The target was a heavily guarded vault, rumored to contain millions in cash and priceless valuables. It was a place few dared to even think about robbing, but Tony was beyond fear. He carefully mapped out the heist, calling on the last of his contacts, those who hadn't yet abandoned him. He promised them a cut so large that it would be impossible to refuse, but deep down, Tony knew this was more than just about the money. It was about proving something to himself, about taking control of his life one final time. Tony reached out to his remaining allies, the few who still trusted him or were desperate enough to take the risk. The team consisted of a tech genius who could hack the security systems, a seasoned safecracker with a reputation for being the best, and a getaway driver with nerves of steel. Each of them had their own reasons for taking on the job. Some needed the money, others sought redemption, and a few just wanted to feel alive again. The tension among them was palpable. Trust was a fragile commodity, and Tony knew that any misstep could lead to betrayal. But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the execution of the plan. He had made it clear, this was a one-time deal, a last shot at redemption or destruction. They were all in, whether they liked it or not. The night of the heist arrived, and Tony's heart pounded as he stood in the shadows, waiting for the signal. The city around him was alive with the usual hum of activity, but for Tony, time had slowed to a crawl. Every second felt like an eternity, every sound amplified as his mind raced through the plan one last time. He couldn't afford any mistakes, not now. The team moved with precision. The tech genius hacked into the security systems, disabling alarms and cameras with ease. The safecracker, under intense pressure, worked his magic, opening the vault door with a skill honed over years. Tony felt a brief flicker of hope as they neared the final stages of the operation. Maybe, just maybe, this would work, but as the vault door swung open, revealing the treasure inside, something went wrong. A silent alarm, one that the tech genius had overlooked, triggered a response from the authorities. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Tony's heart sank. They were out of time. Panic set in as the team scrambled to grab as much as they could before fleeing. The plan was unraveling, and Tony could feel the walls closing in around him. He grabbed a bag of cash and sprinted toward the exit, the sound of sirens growing louder with each passing second. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, of getting away clean, but he knew the odds were against him. The getaway driver was waiting, engine running, ready to speed them away from the scene. Tony dove into the car, barking orders as the driver floored it, tires screeching as they raced through the city streets. The chase was on, and Tony's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire, but the police were relentless, closing in from all sides. Tony's mind raced as he tried to come up with a new plan, a way out of the trap that was closing around him. He had one last card to play, one final gamble that could turn the tide in his favor. As they sped through the city, Tony spotted an opportunity, a narrow alleyway that could lead them to safety or end in disaster. It was a risky move, one that required split-second timing and nerves of steel. He ordered the driver to take the alley, betting everything on this one final gamble. The car veered into the alley, narrowly avoiding a collision with a pursuing police vehicle. The alley was tight, the walls closing in around them as the car barreled forward. For a moment, it seemed like they might make it, that Tony's gamble would pay off, but fate had other plans. As they neared the end of the alley, a barricade appeared in their path, an impassable wall of police vehicles blocking their escape. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded to a stop, and Tony knew the game was over. The team was surrounded, their escape route cut off, and Tony realized that his final gamble had failed. The police closed in, weapons drawn, and Tony felt a cold, bitter acceptance settle over him. This was the end of the road, the price he had to pay for his defiance, his recklessness, his relentless pursuit of freedom. As he was led away in handcuffs, Tony looked back at the scene of his last stand. The thrill, the danger, the excitement, all of it had led him here, to this final moment of defeat. But despite the outcome, Tony felt a strange sense of peace. He had played the game his way, made his own choices, and in the end, he had no regrets. Tony's last gamble had cost him everything, but for a brief moment, he had lived life on his own terms. And that, he realized, was the one thing that no one could ever take away from him. Tony sat in the cold, sterile cell, the silence around him heavy with the weight of his recent choices. The adrenaline that had fueled his every move had long since faded, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. Now, alone with his thoughts, Tony was forced to confront the full consequences of his actions. There was no escaping the reality of what he had done, no more running from the man he had become. The trial was swift, the evidence against Tony overwhelming. Witnesses from his old life, those he had once trusted, came forward to testify against him. The authorities had pieced together the events leading up to the heist, uncovering every reckless decision Tony had made. His transformation from a grieving husband into a wanted criminal was laid bare for all to see. The prosecution painted a damning picture, portraying Tony as a man consumed by grief, who had let his pain drive him to madness. His lawyer attempted to plead for leniency, citing his tragic loss and the psychological toll it had taken. But the judge was unmoved, the law clear and unforgiving. Tony was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, with no possibility of parole. As the gavel came down, sealing his fate, Tony felt a mixture of emotions, anger, regret, but also a strange sense of relief. The chase was over, and the mask he had worn for so long could finally be discarded. There was no more need to pretend, no more need to be the man everyone else expected him to be. For better or worse, Tony had made his choices, and now he would live with them. Back in his cell, Tony replayed the events that had led him here, focusing on the betrayal that had sealed his downfall. Someone from his inner circle had turned on him, selling him out to save themselves. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with a cold fury. He had trusted these people, seen them as allies in his descent into darkness, and they had repaid him with treachery. But as the days passed, Tony's anger began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of the world he had chosen to inhabit. Betrayal was a part of that world, as natural as the air he breathed. He had seen it happen to others, and now it had happened to him. In the end, it was just another consequence of the life he had embraced, another price to be paid for his freedom. As Tony settled into the monotony of prison life, he had plenty of time to reflect on the path that had led him here. He thought about the man he used to be, the peaceful life he had once shared with his wife. That life felt like a distant memory, a dream that had faded in the harsh light of reality. But Tony also knew that he could never go back to that life, even if given the chance. His wife's death had changed him, shattered the illusion of control he had once held so dear. The impulsive, devil-may-care attitude he had adopted was as much a shield as it was a weapon, a way to keep the pain at bay. But in the end, it had led him to a place he could never have imagined. And now, with all his bridges burned and no way to turn back, Tony had to find a way to live with the man he had become. Life in prison was a far cry from the thrill and danger of the outside world. The walls were closing in, and Tony was left to face the reality of his choices. But he didn't shy away from it. He knew that this was the life he had chosen, and he was determined to face it head-on. The reckoning had come, and Tony was ready to meet it on his own terms. He began to make peace with his new reality, finding solace in the routine of prison life. The chaos and danger of his past were behind him now, replaced by a grim stability. It wasn't the freedom he had once sought, but it was a kind of freedom nonetheless, a freedom from the lies, the betrayals, and the endless chase. Tony had finally found a place where he could be himself, even if that place was a prison cell. As the years passed, Tony came to accept his fate. The man who had once burned with rage and defiance had been tempered by time and experience. The reckoning had taken everything from him, his freedom, his allies, his old life, but it had also given him something in return. It had given him clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of who he was and what he had done. Tony knew that he would never leave these walls, never return to the life he had once known. But he also knew that he didn't need to. He had lived his life on his own terms, made his own choices, and faced the consequences head-on. And in the end, that was enough. As he lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, Tony felt a sense of peace settle over him. The reckoning had come and gone, and now all that was left was to live with the man he had become. And for the first time in a long time, Tony was okay with that. Tony sat on the small wooden stool in his prison cell, the dim light casting long shadows on the cold, concrete walls. The relentless noise of the prison had become a distant hum in his ears, a backdrop to the thoughts swirling in his mind. As he stared at the faded photograph of his wife, the edges worn from years of handling, Tony found himself reflecting on the long and winding road that had brought him here. He thought back to the life he had once lived, a life of routine, comfort, and predictability. There had been a time when Tony had taken solace in the simple pleasures of that life, finding joy in the mundane moments he shared with his wife. Their quiet mornings together, the laughter they shared over dinner, the warmth of her presence as they drifted off to sleep. It was a life that had seemed perfect, a world where he had felt safe and secure, but that world had been shattered in an instant, and everything Tony had known had been ripped away from him. The grief had been unbearable, a black hole that consumed him from the inside out. He had tried to cling to the remnants of his old life, but they had slipped through his fingers like sand. In the end, the man who had once found peace in the ordinary had been transformed into someone he scarcely recognized. As he continued to reflect, Tony thought about the choices he had made along the way. Each decision had been a step further down a path that led him away from the person he once was. The letter from his wife had been the catalyst, pushing him to confront the emptiness that had taken hold of his heart. But instead of finding a way to heal, Tony had chosen to fill that emptiness with risk, danger, and a newfound sense of defiance. That he had burned bridges, cut ties, and thrown caution to the wind. He had taken risks that, in his former life, he never would have considered. And with each gamble, he had felt a strange sense of freedom, a freedom from the constraints of his old self, from the expectations of others. But that freedom had come at a price he was now paying in full. Tony's thoughts drifted to the darker impulses that had driven him in those days. He had embraced a side of himself that he had long kept hidden, a side that reveled in the thrill of the unknown, the danger of the forbidden. The heist, the betrayals, the confrontations, they had all been part of a dance with darkness, a way to numb the pain of his loss, but as he looked back now, Tony realized that the darkness had not been an escape, it had been a trap. It had lured him in with promises of freedom, only to ensnare him in a web of consequences he could not escape. The man who had once sought to outrun his grief had instead found himself running in circles, chasing a shadow that only grew larger with each step. And yet, despite it all, Tony couldn't help but feel a sense of acceptance. The man he had become was not the man he had once been, but he was still Tony, changed, but not entirely lost. He had faced his demons, confronted the consequences of his actions, and come to terms with the choices he had made. The recklessness, the defiance, the descent into darkness, it had all been part of a journey that had brought him to this moment of reflection. Tony knew that he could never return to the life he had once known. That world was gone, as was the man who had lived in it. But he had also come to understand that his journey had been necessary, a way to confront the pain that had threatened to consume him. In the end, it had led him to a place of clarity, a place where he could finally see himself for who he truly was. As he placed the photograph back on the small shelf next to his bed, Tony felt a quiet peace settle over him. The past was the past, and there was no changing what had been. But the future, uncertain as it was, held the promise of something more, a chance to live with the man he had become, to find a new kind of peace in the midst of the storm. Tony took a deep breath and closed his eyes, allowing the memories to fade into the background. He knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came next. The reflection had brought him to a place of acceptance, a place where he could finally let go of the past and look forward to the future, whatever it might hold. Tony's days in prison had settled into a routine, a predictable rhythm that offered him the stability he had longed for. But beneath the surface of this new normal, a deeper change was taking root. The time for reflection had given way to a resolve to seek redemption, not just for himself but for the choices he had made and the lives he had affected. As he walked the prison yard, Tony watched the other inmates interact, their conversations punctuated by laughter, anger, and the occasional moment of camaraderie. He had always kept to himself, maintaining a wary distance from those around him. But now, a sense of purpose pushed him to reach out, to make amends in whatever way he could. Tony began by engaging in conversations with other inmates, offering a listening ear and a word of advice when needed. He had always been a good listener, a skill that now proved invaluable. Through these interactions, he found himself connecting with people from different walks of life, each carrying their own burdens and regrets. One inmate, a young man named Jake, was serving time for a crime that Tony could relate to all too well, one driven by desperation and a lack of options. Tony took Jake under his wing, offering guidance and support. He shared his own story, not as a cautionary tale but as a means of understanding and hope. Jake's transformation, from a sullen and withdrawn figure to someone who actively sought to better himself, became a small victory for Tony. Tony's newfound resolve extended beyond personal interactions. He sought ways to contribute to the prison community, using his skills and knowledge to help others. He volunteered for various programs, from educational classes to vocational training, where he could offer his expertise and guidance. One of his most fulfilling endeavors was leading a literacy program. Many inmates struggled with reading and writing, and Tony found that helping them improve these skills was a form of redemption for his own past mistakes. He took pride in seeing his students gain confidence and find new opportunities, their progress a testament to the positive impact he was striving to make. Tony's path to redemption also led him to confront his past actions directly. He began writing letters to the families affected by his crimes, offering a sincere apology for the pain and suffering he had caused. The process was difficult, filled with moments of self-doubt and anguish, but Tony felt it was a crucial step in seeking forgiveness. One of the letters he wrote was to the family of a man who had been injured during the heist. The letter was heartfelt, expressing Tony's remorse and acknowledging the impact of his actions. While he did not expect forgiveness, he hoped that his words might offer some measure of solace and demonstrate his genuine regret. The journey toward redemption was not without its challenges. Tony had to confront his own feelings of guilt and shame, often struggling with the weight of his past actions. But he faced these emotions head-on, seeking to understand the motivations behind his choices and the consequences that followed. He attended therapy sessions offered by the prison, engaging in group discussions and individual counseling. Through these sessions, Tony began to unravel the complexities of his actions and their effects on others. It was a painful process, but one that was essential for his own healing and growth. As Tony continued to work toward redemption, he found that his efforts were not just about making amends but also about rediscovering his own sense of purpose. He realized that while he could not change the past, he could shape his present and future through his actions and choices. He began to take a more active role in advocating for rehabilitation and reform within the prison system, using his own experiences to highlight the need for second chances and support for those seeking to turn their lives around. His voice, once silenced by regret, now carried a message of hope and transformation. Tony's journey toward redemption was far from over, but he had come to a place where he felt a sense of peace with his efforts. He knew that true redemption was a lifelong pursuit, a continuous process of self-improvement and service to others. And while he faced the reality of his prison sentence, he also embraced the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of those around him. As he looked out from his cell, the sun setting on the horizon, Tony felt a quiet satisfaction. The road to redemption had been arduous and filled with obstacles, but it had also offered him a chance to find meaning and purpose in his life. The journey had led him to a place of acceptance, forgiveness, and hope, a place where he could finally see the possibility of a better future, even within the confines of his prison cell. Tony sat on the edge of his narrow prison bed, the small cell feeling unusually stifling. The muted light filtering through the barred window seemed dimmer than usual, casting a pall over the room that mirrored the gravity of his thoughts. The time for contemplation was drawing to a close, and Tony knew he had to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. In recent months, Tony had been offered a glimmer of hope, a chance for early release through a work release program. It was an opportunity that came with conditions: continued participation in rehabilitation programs, good behavior, and a commitment to giving back to the community. The prospect of freedom had ignited a flicker of hope within him, a chance to start anew beyond the prison walls. Tony had worked hard to earn this chance. His efforts to contribute to the prison community, his participation in therapy, and his commitment to personal growth had all played a role in his favorable evaluation. He had become a model inmate, someone who had turned his life around in the face of overwhelming adversity. But now, faced with the reality of the choice before him, Tony grappled with the implications of accepting or declining the opportunity. On one hand, the prospect of freedom was tantalizing. It promised a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the confines of his cell and rebuild his life on his own terms. Tony could envision himself taking up work in a community program, continuing his efforts to help others, and perhaps even finding a place where he could make a positive impact. On the other hand, Tony felt a profound sense of responsibility toward the life he had lived and the people he had wronged. Accepting the early release would mean stepping back into a world that had been shaped by his past actions. He was deeply aware that this freedom would come with its own set of challenges and expectations. The burden of his past, the weight of his actions, and the need to make amends still loomed large. Tony's decision was further complicated by his ongoing efforts to seek redemption. He had made significant strides in confronting his past, reaching out to those he had wronged, and working to improve the lives of others within the prison. He had found a renewed sense of purpose in these efforts, and the thought of leaving this behind was both daunting and disheartening. In the quiet moments of reflection, Tony considered the impact of his potential release on the lives he had touched. Would leaving now, when he was so close to achieving his goals, diminish the progress he had made? Would it send the message that redemption could be achieved quickly, without the sustained effort required to truly make amends? In the weeks leading up to his decision, Tony sought counsel from his prison counselor, his fellow inmates, and his mentor from the literacy program. Each conversation offered a different perspective, adding layers to his understanding of the choice he faced. His counselor reminded him of the importance of personal growth and the opportunity to continue making a difference beyond the prison walls. "Freedom is not just about leaving this place," she said. "It's about taking what you've learned and applying it to the world outside. Your journey doesn't end here." His fellow inmates shared their own stories of release and reintegration, highlighting both the challenges and the rewards of life after prison. "It's tough out there," one inmate said. "But if you're ready and committed, you can make it. Just remember where you came from and stay true to what you've learned." The day of the decision arrived, and Tony found himself standing before the parole board, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The board members listened intently as he spoke about his journey, his efforts to seek redemption, and his vision for the future. As he finished his statement, Tony felt a deep sense of clarity. The choice was not just about freedom or confinement, it was about the kind of person he wanted to be and the legacy he wished to leave behind. He had worked hard to transform himself, to make amends and contribute to the community. Now, it was time to put that transformation to the test. Tony made his choice. He accepted the opportunity for early release, but with a firm commitment to continue his journey of redemption and to use his freedom to make a positive impact. He understood that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it with the same resolve and determination that had guided him through his time in prison. As Tony walked out of the prison gates for the first time in years, the sun on his face felt like a warm embrace, a symbol of the new beginning he was embarking on. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next with the lessons he had learned and the hope he had found. With a heart full of both anticipation and humility, Tony stepped into the world beyond the prison walls. The choice had been made, and now it was time to embrace the future, to continue the work of redemption, and to live a life that honored the man he had become. The path ahead was uncertain, but Tony was prepared to walk it with courage, integrity, and a deep sense of purpose. Tony's first days of freedom were a whirlwind of emotions. The prison gates had closed behind him, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The outside world was both exhilarating and overwhelming, filled with sights, sounds, and smells that Tony had missed during his years of confinement. Each step he took on the pavement felt like a reclaiming of his own life, a fresh start after years of struggle. He had arranged for a modest apartment in a neighborhood that was a far cry from the bustling cityscape he once knew. It was a place of simplicity, with clean walls and a small window that offered a view of a quiet street. The apartment was a blank slate, a space where he could begin to build his new life. One of Tony's first priorities was to reconnect with the outside world and to establish a routine that would help him adjust to his new life. He started by finding a job through a local community program aimed at helping former inmates reintegrate into society. The work was humble, assisting in a community center that provided support to those in need, but it was meaningful. Tony took pride in contributing to a cause that aligned with his newfound sense of purpose. The community center became a second home for Tony, where he met people who were navigating their own challenges and seeking support. His experience in prison, combined with his commitment to helping others, allowed him to connect with the center's patrons on a deep level. He offered guidance, listened to their stories, and shared his own experiences, finding solace in the act of giving back. Tony's efforts to rebuild his life extended to forming new relationships. He knew that his past actions had left scars, and while he wasn't ready to reconnect with his old acquaintances, he sought to forge new connections grounded in his present self. He joined local groups and attended community events, making an effort to engage with people who shared his interests and values. Among the new people in his life was Emma, a social worker who had been instrumental in his transition process. Her support and encouragement had helped Tony navigate the complexities of re-entry. As they worked together on community projects, Tony and Emma developed a friendship that grew into something deeper. Emma's understanding and empathy provided Tony with a sense of companionship and hope for a future that was both promising and uncertain. Even as Tony embraced his new life, he faced the inevitable challenges of adjusting to a world that had moved on without him. The skills he had once taken for granted now required relearning, and the societal changes during his time in prison felt daunting. Technology, social norms, and the fast pace of life presented hurdles that Tony had to overcome. He enrolled in courses to update his skills, focusing on areas that would help him thrive in the modern job market. It was a humbling experience, but one that Tony approached with determination. He knew that learning and adapting were essential for his success and for the future he envisioned. As Tony settled into his new routine, he continued his efforts to contribute to the community. His work at the center evolved into a leadership role, where he helped to develop programs aimed at supporting individuals facing similar struggles. Tony's experience became a powerful tool for inspiring and guiding others, and he took great satisfaction in seeing the positive impact of his efforts. He also maintained his commitment to the principles of redemption and personal growth. Tony remained involved in advocacy for prison reform and rehabilitation, using his voice to raise awareness about the importance of second chances and the need for support systems for those reintegrating into society. With each passing day, Tony reflected on his journey with a mix of gratitude and introspection. He recognized that his path to redemption and rebuilding was a continuous process, one that required ongoing effort and self-awareness. The mistakes of his past were part of who he was, but they did not define him. Instead, he chose to focus on the person he had become and the positive contributions he could make moving forward. The journey was far from perfect, but Tony had come to embrace the imperfections as part of his story. He understood that moving on was not about forgetting the past, but about acknowledging it and using it as a foundation for growth. The new life he was building was a testament to his resilience and the transformative power of redemption. As Tony looked out of his apartment window, watching the sun set over the city, he felt a sense of contentment and hope. The future was still uncertain, but it was filled with possibilities. He had taken the first steps toward rebuilding his life, and while the road ahead would undoubtedly present challenges, he was ready to face them with the strength and determination he had cultivated. Tony's journey was a reminder that redemption and renewal were possible, even in the face of adversity. His story was one of transformation, a testament to the power of second chances and the enduring hope for a better future. And as he embraced the new chapter of his life, Tony did so with a heart full of hope and a spirit ready to forge ahead, one step at a time. Tony's journey from incarceration to redemption had not only transformed his own life but had also begun to influence those around him. The impact of his efforts extended beyond the walls of the community center and touched the lives of many, creating a ripple effect that resonated throughout his new world. The community center, where Tony had initially found a new purpose, became a beacon of hope and support, largely due to his contributions. His leadership and dedication helped to expand its programs and reach, providing valuable resources to individuals who were struggling with similar challenges. Tony's story inspired both staff and clients, serving as a powerful example of the potential for change and growth. Among those who were inspired by Tony's journey was Jake, the young man Tony had mentored during his time in prison. Jake had successfully reintegrated into society, driven by the hope and guidance Tony had provided. He became an advocate for rehabilitation and second chances, sharing his own story and highlighting the transformative power of support and encouragement. Jake's newfound confidence and purpose were a testament to Tony's impact, and his work in the community became a reflection of the positive influence Tony had on his life. Tony's efforts also extended to Emma, the social worker who had become a close friend and, eventually, a romantic partner. Emma had been deeply moved by Tony's commitment to making amends and contributing to the community. Inspired by his passion, she became more involved in advocacy for criminal justice reform and support for former inmates. Together, Tony and Emma worked on various projects, amplifying their voices and efforts to drive meaningful change in their community. Tony's contributions did not go unnoticed. The community center received recognition for its work, partly due to the innovative programs and the compassionate approach that Tony had championed. Local newspapers and community leaders highlighted Tony's story, celebrating his transformation and the positive impact he had made. His journey became a symbol of hope and resilience, encouraging others to believe in the possibility of redemption and renewal. Tony's work in advocating for prison reform and rehabilitation also gained traction. His involvement in speaking engagements and policy discussions helped to raise awareness about the challenges faced by former inmates and the importance of providing support and opportunities for reintegration. His advocacy efforts contributed to broader conversations about criminal justice reform, and his voice became an important part of the dialogue surrounding second chances and the need for systemic change. Tony's personal connections also reflected the legacy of his journey. His relationships with family members, once strained by his past actions, began to heal as he worked to make amends and demonstrate his commitment to change. His family saw the genuine effort he was making to rebuild his life and to contribute positively to society. While the process of rebuilding trust was gradual, the progress was tangible and meaningful. Friends and acquaintances from his past began to notice the changes in Tony. Some reached out to reconnect, acknowledging the transformation they saw in him. These renewed connections provided Tony with a sense of closure and allowed him to share his journey with those who had once been a part of his life. As Tony looked back on his journey, he was filled with a profound sense of gratitude. The legacy he was leaving behind was not just about his personal redemption but about the positive changes he had inspired in others. His story had become a source of hope and motivation for those facing their own struggles, and his efforts had helped to create a more supportive and understanding community. Tony understood that the true measure of his legacy was not in accolades or recognition but in the lives he had touched and the changes he had helped to bring about. His journey was a reminder that even the darkest past could be transformed into a source of strength and inspiration. With his legacy firmly established, Tony continued to work toward his goals with renewed vigor. His commitment to making a difference remained unwavering, and he was dedicated to ensuring that his journey would have a lasting impact. He knew that the path ahead would continue to present challenges, but he faced them with confidence and hope, buoyed by the knowledge that his efforts had already made a meaningful difference. As Tony walked through the streets of his community, interacting with those he had come to know and support, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had been one of transformation, growth, and redemption, and he was grateful for the opportunity to continue making a positive impact. The legacy of Tony's journey was a testament to the power of change and the enduring hope for a better future. It was a story of resilience, compassion, and the profound effect that one person's commitment to redemption could have on the world around them. Tony stood at the edge of a bustling city park, taking in the vibrant scene before him. Children played, couples strolled hand in hand, and the gentle hum of conversation and laughter filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt during his time in prison, and yet, it felt like a place where he could finally start anew. The park had become one of his favorite places, a symbol of his fresh start and the new life he was building. That he had spent the past few months working diligently to rebuild his life, and the results were beginning to take shape. His role at the community center had grown into a leadership position, where he was responsible for spearheading initiatives aimed at supporting individuals facing challenges similar to those he had overcome. The work was fulfilling, and Tony felt a deep sense of purpose in helping others navigate their own journeys of transformation. Tony's newfound purpose extended beyond his professional life. He had also begun exploring interests and passions that had long been dormant. During his time in prison, he had rediscovered a love for writing and had started a journal to document his experiences and reflections. Encouraged by Emma and his colleagues, he had taken a leap of faith and started working on a book, a memoir detailing his journey from incarceration to redemption. The writing process was both cathartic and empowering, allowing Tony to channel his experiences into something meaningful. In addition to writing, Tony had taken up gardening. The simple act of tending to plants and watching them grow provided him with a sense of calm and satisfaction. His small garden was a source of pride, a tangible representation of his efforts to nurture and cultivate something positive in his life. It was a reminder that growth and change were possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. Tony's relationships continued to evolve, and he found himself forging deeper connections with those around him. His bond with Emma grew stronger, built on mutual respect and shared values. They had become a team, supporting each other in their personal and professional endeavors. Emma's unwavering belief in Tony's potential had been a cornerstone of his journey, and their relationship was a testament to the transformative power of love and support. Tony also reconnected with his family, working to repair the relationships that had been strained by his past actions. The process was gradual, but his efforts to demonstrate his commitment to change and his genuine remorse had begun to heal old wounds. The sense of reconciliation and understanding brought a new dimension to his life, adding depth and meaning to his relationships. As Tony looked toward the future, he felt a renewed sense of clarity and direction. His experiences had shaped his vision for what he wanted to achieve, and he was committed to making a lasting impact. He continued to advocate for criminal justice reform, using his platform to raise awareness about the importance of rehabilitation and the need for second chances. Tony's involvement in the community extended to mentoring others who were navigating their own paths of transformation. He began volunteering with organizations that supported former inmates and individuals facing similar struggles. His personal journey made him a valuable resource, and his willingness to share his experiences provided hope and guidance to those who needed it most. The sense of fulfillment that Tony experienced was both profound and deeply gratifying. He had come to understand that his purpose was not just about personal redemption but about making a positive difference in the lives of others. The work he did, the relationships he built, and the passions he pursued all contributed to a life that was rich with meaning and purpose. As Tony stood in the park, watching the world around him, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey he had undertaken had been arduous, but it had led him to a place of renewal and hope. The new beginning he had embraced was not just about moving forward, but about creating a life that honored the lessons he had learned and the person he had become. With a heart full of hope and a spirit ready to embrace whatever came next, Tony faced the future with optimism. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was prepared to walk it with confidence, knowing that his journey had equipped him with the tools to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Tony's new beginning was a testament to the power of resilience, redemption, and the capacity for personal growth. His story was one of transformation, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to find purpose, make a positive impact, and create a meaningful life. And as he continued to build his future, Tony did so with a sense of fulfillment and a deep appreciation for the journey that had brought him to this point. The park, with its vibrant life and boundless possibilities, symbolized the new chapter of Tony's life, one filled with promise, purpose, and the excitement of a fresh start.